it comes to arming the individual with the objective and practical knowledge on how to know what they're looking for, when to look for it, and the frequency of looking at it. There are some risks, but there's definitely an ethical consideration. Something that we've had to be quite careful about is the way that the information is presented, and to be very careful not to make statements in our educational material based on opinion.
Time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we are back with another episode of Table Talk, and today we have Joe and Matt from the Physique Collective. Before I have you guys tell me more about that, I have gifts. I knew this was going to happen. Gifts for you guys.
Oh, thank you so much, Dave. Thank you.
So in there, you can
Awesome.
open it up. There's a t-shirt, Table Talk t-shirt, and there's a notebook that we have in there with a leather book cover that is made from the same company that makes our powerlifting belts.
Oh, very cool.
And I have a reward coin in there that I give to people that I think emulate the vision of elitefts, which is to live, learn, and pass on. So those are unique and special made.
Incredible. Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much.
So thank you guys for coming out. And I guess to jump off, can you tell me how you started the Physique Collective and what it is about?
Sure. I could give you the very long answer or the...
Well, I want to know kind of the evolution of it too.
Okay, well, to reel right back to the beginning, I began coaching. This year was my 10th year, so a decade of coaching in 2 months. So in 2 months' time, I've been online coaching full time. And as you know, like a decade ago, it was a very different thing to what it is now. Like I remember it was me, I would see Tate, Skip Hill, Scott Stevenson to some degree, and my close friend who you had on recently, Austin Stout. I started a podcast with Austin back then, OPD podcast. It's still going today, hundreds of episodes. But as you know, with online coaching, you get a full stable of clients and it continues on and nothing really happens from there. And I used to do a lot of educational consults as well, because my coaching career kind of started off with me publishing articles on PED use, like you would call like evidence-based PED use, where there would be kind of scientific reference-based rather than bro law-based or something like that, which garnered a lot of attention and a lot of educational, you could call it mentorships over the year. But again, you're very limited by the net that you can reach. You know, you can only sit with one person, maybe two people on an hour call. And actually, it was a bit of a interesting turn of events, wasn't it? Because another one of my clients at the time, Gareth, had said, look, a lot of people are releasing apps for coaching, but you can get thousands of people on here. And I said, I'm not interested in having thousands more clients on this kind of low ticket stuff. I like coaching competitors and high level athletes and things like that. And he said, no, what you can do is start to publish educational materials on there at a low price that can net an unlimited amount of people. All we got to do is invest and build the app. So me, Gareth, Matt, and our other friend Christian at the time set out to build the thing, the app.
And when was this?
4 years ago, was it?
Okay.
It was just during lockdown.
Okay.
One of the things that we found as well was obviously lockdown, COVID.
Yeah.
It was a crazy time and everyone was very insular. Everyone was sat at home, and bodybuilding and the physique like community is small enough as it is. Everyone was sat at home, not really doing anything. And part of the Physique Collective thought process was create a community, not just on the education side, but almost you belong to something. And during lockdown, that meant a lot to people, where it wasn't just the education side, it was a family, quote unquote, was what we called it. And I think that got a lot of people kind of through, and it's kept a really close-knit viewpoint on that, jumping off the back of the education side of it as well.
Yeah, and I remember we had a business meeting in the really early years of the business, and the what would you even call it, business mentor, whatever you call that kind of person, said, you know, what do you want, what is the whole aim of this business, you know, to get that straight. And I said I wanted to create something that I desperately needed when I was 15, 16, you know, because I can remember going on steroid.com, anabolic steroid forums.com, you know, and seeing whatever biggest avatar,
whatever is
you
the
know,
key word there.
You know, whoever's got the largest avatar, what's he running?
It was bodybuilding.com.
I better do that.
Yeah.
Me and Joe were chatting yesterday. I was saying I was a member of the elitefts forums back in 2009, And back then, no one would talk about drugs. It was like a very different landscape than we got nowadays.
He actually checked his emails to see when the first
I was thinking, when was
elite
the first
FDS order was. Was it 15, 16 years ago or something? Yeah.
So we just thought, right, we've got to put something out there. And the entire kind of philosophy that we put together was physique development simplified, which again simplifies it even further. But it was really getting people the education we needed, but also, especially within the PED world, we looked at it like, remember when you were at school and they said, don't do drugs, kids, don't do drugs. But people were like, fuck this, I'm going to go and do drugs anyway. That's what it was like with PEDs. You're like, yeah, don't take drugs. And they're going to go, I'm going to go talk to the biggest guy in the gym and I'm going to get some bad information off him. Where we thought, we're seeing reams of people getting hurt with this stuff. So we want to put out content that was going to help them in a way that wasn't promoting it. We're not saying take drugs.
I was going to say, you didn't see this as a risk from the beginning?
Massively saw it as a risk, yeah.
There are some risks, but there's definitely an ethical consideration. Something that we've had to be quite careful about is the way that the information is presented, and to be very careful not to make statements in our educational material based on opinion.
Yeah, see, I used to have a policy on our site with the people there is I never wanted them to lie, but I didn't want them to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because of that risk portfolio
So if I
played in there.
Jumping forward a bit, just to answer your question here, like if you're on our forum and I was maybe talking about a case study of me and a client, I'd make it very clear that this was a purely anecdotal practice. It's not like this is
Well, things are very different now than they were 10 years ago, too.
Oh, there's been a huge shift.
There was a shift, and I can't really pinpoint when that was. You might know.
It's hard to say.
I think
a little bit before COVID.
Yes, correct. And I think it was more so one person hugely responsible, I think, is again my friend John Jewett, I think.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of the same crop. Me, John and Scott Stevenson talk quite frequently about these things. And it seems to be that's where that shift went over, where you finally had somebody of a large scale enough influence that represented a model, if you want to call it that, of PED use that has practical application that eventuates to results, but negates some of the negative health consequences. Because one of the things that we were battling with that we discuss quite frequently is like, sure, we could say, here's harm reduction practices, never use more than 150 milligrams a week, and then nobody listens. So what we always said is,
it's got to be real world.
You see this term of like safer use model batted about, and I don't really like using that terminology because I think it
implies that
it implies safety.
Yeah.
Or it infers safety when there's no safety, but there's risk management. So I would like to be seen as the person that presented evidence that would help people to, let's say they want to get to this place. If they can genetically get there and they have the wherewithal to get there, the commitment to get there, then they will still get there. It might take them a little bit longer, but it will be risk managed as compared to
going all out.
Yeah, going all out and paying the cost of doing so.
I use a lot of analogies. I'm like an analogy guy. So I always talk about Formula One. I was like, these guys are absolutely going for the fastest lap times. They are spending all their money on performance. That's the name of the game. They still invest in safety. They still wear crash helmets. They still have roll bars. They're still looking after the people driving the cars. That's the way we view it. We're not taking away from the performance side. We want them to get there safely. We don't want dead drivers in this example. So that was a big factor. But that was kind of the ethos behind what we did. And the main driving force behind it was the PED chat, because I think in the UK, we're in that unique situation where drugs are legal. So it's not like US where you just can get in prison or anything like that. We've obviously we can happily talk about it, we can buy it, there's no repercussions there. So therefore us talking about it, we haven't got any ramifications to our family or anything like that. People are happy just for us to talk. And when more and more people that we coached and kind of bigger names, it gives a bit of sort of, I guess, evidence to what we're doing is correct, or at least right, or at least works.
But up until that one tipping point, you wouldn't be able to put out any YouTube videos or any social media without it getting hammered.
Yeah. I mean, because we were never sensationalized it. We were never like, this is what you should do. Like TikTok nowadays is like, take trend, take all these things. And it's becoming this like, oh yeah, fuck it, we're going to take all these drugs. And it's almost becoming like a joke. We were never doing that. We're like, these drugs, this is how they work. This is why you may consider using them. And these are how to avoid as much of the side effects as possible. And kind of doing it that way rather than, I don't know, you see Natty or Not and all this shit where people are, I don't think you're making it a bit more a bit more like MTV, TMZ type news as opposed to education, which is what we want to do.
How do you find walking the line between you need to be kind of pro enough that your population will listen to you, right? That you need to be relatable, and you come across as you're not saying to people just don't. You're not trying to be that teacher who's just saying don't do drugs, but you also need to be negative enough to explain the reality of what people are actually taking upon them. So how do you find yourselves that you handle that balance, especially because you're probably naturally going to be maybe slightly more towards the pro side, because otherwise you wouldn't be here doing this, right? So how do you deal with that, like trying to alter what lens you look at it for the benefit of your audience and trying to take your own personal bias?
So yeah, great question. The way that I've managed this is almost having the information presented as two separate streams, you could imagine it as. So, I still coach high-level competitors. I've got clients across all federations, pro, amateur. I've had clients on the Olympia stage, etc. So if I'm talking about a case report of what's happened to a client or discussing a client's blood work or echocardiogram results or whatever, I'll just be completely honest and say, this is what happens at this level in the industry, but there's huge biological individuality as well. So this is what this person's doing. It might not be right for you. The next person might require way more. This is a huge risk. Here's the costs. If they haven't had any costs, then I'll be honest. They're just genetically not so susceptible to those costs you may be. But then on our educational material, it's presented with an evidence-based lens. So there'll be references cited for every statement made. There's no claims made without evidence being presented in our educational material. And that'll be kept somewhat separate from the purely bodybuilding-esque material. And that educational information is presented for individuals to interpret and do with as they please.
Sure. Do you find it difficult to go down that evidence-based route without getting drop-off from some of your listeners? Because if people have come into this from we don't know what else to call it, right? So we call it bro science, whatever it is. If you go too hard on the science side, you probably lose a lot of them, right? So how do you deal with kind of getting this balance of like, you need to understand what these drugs actually do to kind of know when to use them, what to use, how much, whatever, but you can't turn it into like a master's degree in physiology, right? Because then you're going to lose them. So how do you approach that, trying to find the balance there with the demographic that you're speaking to?
I think it's understanding them, as in I'm not talking like a one-to-one basis, because if it's a one-to-one conversation, you can probably get a bit more out of that person. But we kind of understand our demographic quite well, and we're not the sort of people that put out to judge people. We're very much talking about this is what happens, this is what works, but we don't want to like baffle the wood bullshit. That's not the goal here. It's not to make them feel stupid. It's to make them feel heard and understood. Where you've got a place that we understand why you may want to take these, and this is some of the reasons you're going down this route. If you want to do that, these things are probably also quite important to you. You're probably concerned about your health. Have you considered these forms of toxicity from anabolic steroid use? And they're like, oh shit, I didn't know that. Oh, is having kids important to you later in life? Oh, I didn't think of that. So you're saying on one hand, yes, absolutely, you can take these drugs, but I can't stop you taking them. But on the other side, have you thought about these other repercussions that come with that? We can talk about the evidence-based side of it, or these are the risks, but it's also playing into the visceral thing of like, what matters to you? Because if I said to you, I don't know, you might not have kids. Why are you doing this? You're like, well, I don't want kids anyway, so fuck off. And these are the reasons why. If you then focus on the like these are the specific toxicities we're going to get with anabolic steroid use, and like relate that in a manner that they're going to understand, you're going to get better buy-in. But if you just talk at people, they're never going to listen.
Yeah. So a couple of things to mention on this is you can really only cite literature up to a certain degree when it comes to PED use. Like take anabolic androgenic steroids, for example, like the highest dose that we see in men on testosterone on any study, the Basin study, famous, 600 milligrams a week, is barely scratching the surface of what bodybuilders do. It wouldn't be uncommon to see 10x that not so long ago. Not so common now, but still happens, obviously. So you can develop a robust understanding of individual molecules and their mechanisms of action or their pharmacokinetics, just the pharmacology in general of these molecules, and then apply them to a human setting. I mean, one of the things that we really press, and I know John's a big fan of this as well, is not to use any PEDs that haven't been approved for human clinical use, or especially haven't been at least trialed to have some kind of safety testing data in a human population. So you can gather some information, but not in the practical sense of, well, if I use this alongside all of this other pharmacopoeia, you know, in this polypharmacy model, what actually happens? We're never going to get that research because no one's going to fund that. But you can at least develop that understanding up to some degree of comprehensive nature about single molecules. And at that point, I think it comes to arming the individual with the objective and practical knowledge on how to know what they're looking for, when to look for it, and the frequency of looking at it. And if they're armed with that knowledge without I hate to say more is better or more is more, because it is. Right? We know there's a dose response. There's an inverted U, of course, but there's a positive dose response to these things. But, more so an accumulation of vectors over time with strategies built in place to carefully manage what happens along the way. I think even if they do want to be more bullish, it's at least better than whatever the other option was.
Sure.
So
do you think for educators like yourself, and then for others who maybe you're encouraging to kind of go in, if they do go into that research rabbit hole at all, is the research really there for us to learn about mechanisms then, as opposed to protocols? Because we're never going to get a protocol comparing a competition prep with this much tren and this much decaverse. But we do have studies that show, well, this is what tren does in the body or testosterone does in the body, and then you've got to kind of piece it together yourself. Would that be a good way of saying its role there?
Absolutely.
I think mechanistically we kind of know how all these drugs work, and we're in quite a good position where we know, okay, these are what drugs do. We know the mechanism which they grow muscle, they stop muscle breakdown, but also how they contribute to your toxicities as well. We kind of know what that looks like. But then when you throw that we're going to throw all these drugs into an individual, it's open season. We don't know what's going on there. But we can sort of connect the dots. And when you've kind of got the baseline stuff in place, you're like, okay, we're taking this for this purpose, this for this purpose. Everything's got a reason. We can start to then assess if something breaks down. Okay, blood work showing this, we can see this. If they're getting this response, if this, then that. And that comes from, we talked about what evidence-based really means, because evidence-based, it seems to be this thing where, like, unless you've got a PubMed reference, it doesn't mean that. We take it as the evidence we've got from seeing people in this world, right? So we've got the data, like you say, the mechanistic stuff, but then when it's connecting the dots, it's just the amount of bodies we've seen over the years and how much experience we've got from other people, other coaches who've also seen a lot of bodies, and we're putting our sort of pooled information together. That's still evidence that we can then use, and that's actually going to be, I don't want to say more relevant, but somewhat relevant within the population, because we can say, well, actually, we've not got a study on a bodybuilder with X, Y, Z, then a million other drugs in the system, but that's a standard contest prep. So if we've seen that 1,000 times with 1,000 different coaches who've collected information, how is that any worse than a study per se, if we're confident in that data, which we can be? So I think something give a bit of a politician's answer, but it's taking the objective data that we got from mechanistic stuff and then pulling it with what still is evidence-based from what's happening in the real world.
Sure. Do you think, though, that then also that's where what you guys do in terms of, taking people through these competitive cycles and stuff like that becomes as much art as it does science? Because even like blood work panels are an art, right? We all have reference ranges, but really how useful are they, and how do people feel and respond to different? So, when you're trying to explain your processes to people, do you ever struggle trying to get that across in that, yes, there's science and science is important, but also there's a whole other field where, like, until you've done X amount of contest preps with certain amounts of individuals, you just don't know how people respond. There's always going to be that kind of error margin.
Yeah, I think there's like broad sweeping generalizations you can make with the pharmacology. If we could teach somebody that, as a whole, if you look at anabolic androgenic steroids as a category of drugs, this one metabolic pathway, so like the androgen receptor, we know that there's going to be anabolism, so they're going to push muscle protein synthesis up. In some cases, there's going to be anti-catabolism if they've got a binding affinity for the glucocorticoid receptor. If you've got, let's say, beta-2 adrenergic receptor agonist like clenbuterol, right, we know that there's lipolysis and there's anti-catabolism to some degree. And, you can go down all of these different metabolic pathways. If someone can understand, like, as a broad sweeping statement, these contribute to these outcomes that will reflect this thing on the physique, but then understand that the biological individuality to what magnitude each of those is impacted is ridiculously large. Like we talked about the basin study. I don't know if you've ever looked at the plot. It's like people that gain this much muscle on 600 milligrams, and then there was that one guy that didn't gain any muscle, you know, and you might be that guy. You know, there's no absolute outcome, but like you said, understanding the mechanisms. Yeah, the androgen receptor, binding of androgens to the androgen receptor is going to transcribe anabolism. You're going to get an increase in muscle protein synthesis and mTOR and other, you know, anabolic machinery. To what degree? At what milligrams? You don't know, you know. So we can tell you that. We can give you averages, you know, mean response rates and things like that. And then it's up to you.
True.
But this is also why we would maybe recommend a titration model of your PED exposure over time, rather than, right, well, I'm going to try a gram of test. I'm going to go from 150 to a gram, see what the outcome is. Well, you know, will it grow muscle faster than slowly walking up to a gram? Yeah, arguably, if you're talking acutely, certainly. Long term, depends on your length of exposure. You know, it's probably down to total milligrams of exposure, X milligrams over Y time or something like that, if you wanted to formulaically plot it. But if you accumulate, let's say you go 150 to 300 and you hold that for 6 weeks, and you can watch what's going on to your physique. Maybe you could get some blood work, get an echocardiogram, calcium score test, see how you as a biologically unique individual respond to that.
Our strength equipment is made in the USA. It's professional rated. We customize it to whatever your needs are. If it's just logoing to designing a completely brand new piece of equipment. The reason I got into the equipment game to begin with is a lot of the equipment I was looking for example, like a leg press, I couldn't use a wide enough stance to help build my squat out. So a lot of the equipment that we've come up with and that we've put out is built for that reason, because it wasn't on the market or it was built like crap in the first place and didn't have any carryover. So check out our website, elitefts.com, strength equipment, or get a hold of one of our strength equipment specialists who have been selling strength equipment for over a decade, as well as being coaches in the industry. Website, Top Toolbar Strength Equipment, or look for the rectangle on the front page that says Strength Equipment Specialist and click on that to speak to one of our specialists today.
And then maybe you could go to 450, testosterone alone. Oh, I can tolerate that. I don't need to use an aromatase inhibitor or a SERM. Cool, great. More estrogen, better. You know, maybe then you spend some time, then go to 600. Oh, I've just learned at 600 milligram for me, as a genetically unique individual, I get some estrogenic side effects. So I know that that's my peak tolerable amount of estradiol contribution from testosterone alone. Because that's going to vary between individuals. And, you know, we do want to do all we can to avoid AI and SERM use if we can. So then that individual's armed with the information to know that if they want to go over that 450, in absence of estrogenic side effects, in absence of using an AI, etc., they would have to use an androgen that doesn't have aromatase action, like a DHT derivative, mastron, primobolan, something like that. So if you can follow this process and be patient, you can learn about you as an individual, but it's a time cost. You know,
I was going to say, it sounds a lot like you're asking people to take responsibility and be patient.
I would hope so.
Sorry, I hijacked your background story there. I apologize.
In the real world, wouldn't it be, and these would be people that have not reached out to you, that their process is going to be
A little bit different.
Yes, I'm getting stronger, so it's working. I'm not
Yeah.
getting stronger. I need to take more. And then they just keep going up until they start breaking out or some side effect hits.
But that's the bit you mentioned about the art, is what you're saying, right, is a lot of people aren't going to do that. They aren't going to go through that process because there's a time cost. And everyone wants it now. I want to get jacked now. I don't want to wait this time. And that's why I think the art of seeing bodies and seeing things like through the coaching eye is going to help, because you can say, okay, on average, yes, they may be able to tolerate a gram of test. They may be able to tolerate 200. Let's just go in with I hate to say this, but standard cycle based on our experience, and then assess as we go, assuming that their speed they want to go at is quicker. That's where I think the art of coaching comes in a bit more, is because then you've got the movement on the fly. Ideally, what we want is to stepwise increment, but we also understand that most people don't want to work like that unless they're really, really patient. So we have to kind of use that art alongside the practical, I guess, recommendations and knowing what these drugs do.
I think in many ways we were quite lucky with the timing of the launch of the app as well, because I was already a well-established contest prep coach, putting people on stage in great condition. This isn't me like waxing lyrical about myself. Or maybe it is, whatever. But so people saw that happening, so that when I spoke about, let's say, models or protocols or whatever, a lot of people listened because it was genuinely what I was using, and my clients would say, yes, this is what, and luckily quite a lot of my clients are on the app, posting on the forum, logging on there. We don't pay them to do that or anything like that. We're just very lucky to have great people on there, and they'll log their whole contest prep. So people can follow that and see, well, when they're telling me about this, I hate to use the word model, but when they're telling me about this approach that I could take that maybe mitigates a lot of risk, and actually there's IFBB pros doing this and winning shows, it's not just some dweeb, because I'm not exactly muscular, you know what I mean? It's not just some dweeb telling me to take less gear because he could never be big. I mean, that is true. But
that's beside the point.
It is literally a dweeb telling you to take less gear. But at least with some kind of social equity, you know, to show here's a stable of clients, and all of the guys that work under Physique Collective that are great coaches like Leon, like Ryan, who also have a full stable of clients, putting them on stage in great shape, all doing this thing. Well, you know, yeah, there's a great degree of variability, but people are winning shows, you know, so it has to at least pass the works. So that people are more likened to believe it.
There's a bit of social proof there.
Yeah.
I think because we've also come in that world where we were mentioning about the forums, right? Where everyone's taking, if you're not taking a gram of tren a week, what are you even living? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Right. And trying to convince people that maybe that's not the best approach, right? They're going to go, well, more is more. I go, it is until it isn't. Yeah. Because if that was all that ever worked, why is all the pros not doing that nowadays? Why they're lying to us? Okay, then it's us versus them. But when we've actually got practical proof of, we've got a lot of pros, a lot of guys on the, I guess, the Physique Collective roster, should I say, who actually, this is what we do. It adds a bit of authority to what we're saying, is you don't need to do 6-10 grams a week. Maybe for some people, but it's not really the best way.
Where the coaching becomes an art then for you guys is as much of it, I would say, the art side of it, the communication aspect, because you're going to have people who are wired like David's saying, where like there's this more is more and I want everything now. So coming from the coaching side then is as much of the art getting the buy-in and being able to explain the process in that way, as opposed to even making the adjustments. It's actually having the mental buy-in, because, you know, you can put a model towards someone and being like, this is what your cycle should look like. How many of you have experienced though, like clients are like, yeah, I'm following the protocol on top of the 2 other injections every week I'm doing I don't tell you about.
I was going to go there.
Yeah. So what kind of barriers do you find that you have to break down when you're communicating these, I want to say conservative models, but they lead to better results. They're not conservative, but that's how they'll be perceived.
Yeah, let me also be clear as well. Look, that's not to say that I don't have clients that will be in the 2 to 3 gram range, you know, that will take 10, 12 units of growth hormone, that will take 30 to 50 units of insulin. I coach super heavyweight IFBB pros. That stuff happens. And again, we're results based. I hate to say it, before we're health based, you know, because my clients pay me to get them to win shows. And there's no way I'm putting some guy on 300 milligram safer use model versus other guy with the same genetics on 3 grams. It's going to wax him. So it's more so about how do we structure this with a risk mitigation formula rather than just do less. In many cases, it won't be do less. They'll probably do exactly the same milligrams, but structure the stack design differently. Maybe make use of other metabolic pathways so that you can pull this one down a little bit. Maybe we shift this around so we don't rely so much on ancillaries. Maybe we follow a periodization that accumulates slowly rather than all on all the time. Maybe we auto-regulate dosage based on phase needs rather than it always be turned up, for example. Or maybe we gather data to know when your exposure starts to peak you over into that excessive oxidative stress, excessive inflammation point. Now we know the max that you can tolerate, X duration over Y amount or whatever it may be. Because for some people, that would be the case. Like, how much can you take before you fall apart? And that is safer than the other option.
I think the other bit to mention is I look at the answer to your question as 2 things. One is the authority. Like, I'm thinking of like American football. Imagine Bill Belichick. Like, people, he'll just say something, people can listen. So he's got that track record of success. So if you've got that behind you, that's great. The other side of it is again, the communication things, how you speaking to that person. And I think you can get a lot out of people by just understanding them from a coaching perspective and understanding kind of, I hate this phrase, but their why. What's the reasons for this? And there's usually underpinned with some other stuff in there as well. So if you understand that person as an individual, and let's say is a bodybuilder, right? Let's say their desire is to be the best. Well, what does be the best look like to you? Is it purely take more drugs? Is that what be the best means to you? Because if that is, we're not on the same page what be the best means. But if be the best means the best bodybuilder, that's someone who's also going to, okay, you can do your cardio, you can manage your stress, manage your sleep, look after your health. Those are all things which are risk mitigation strategies at the end of the day. And you'll be surprised, maybe not surprised, how many bodybuilders like, I don't eat any vegetables and fruit. I'm like, cool. And you say you want to be the best, but you're not doing the basics. So I think you can absolutely push the envelope with one side of it, but also having that communication element of like, okay, if you want to be a good bodybuilder, this is what a good bodybuilder means on top of that. And I think that's often, it's kind of filling in the blanks. It's not necessarily taking away from what they're doing. It's raising the bottom end of the system and just making them better overall. And I think that's where the communication element is huge. And then when you start to get that sort of social proof, like the back catalogue of results, people are more inclined to believe you on the off chance.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned various factors there. You mentioned oxidative stress. So this is a good segue into like the importance of baseline health in what you do.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about making sure they're healthy on the other end, but actually enhancing their results. How do you go about getting across the importance of these things, and what are the types of practices and like barometers that you use to measure, should we say, general health?
Great question.
So that you can have these people achieving super health or incredible results or whatever.
We talk about people on PEDs here.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the populations that you're dealing with.
So I would look at the toxicities of PED use. What have we got essentially? And if we look at all the research, we can like characterize that down into like 6 forms. So we say like brain, liver, kidney, heart, vascular, and what am I missing, Joe? Brain, liver, kidney, heart, vascular. I've gone blank. There's one more, and I'll come back to me in a minute.
Neurological, hepatic, renal,
I've gone blank.
cardiac.
It's been a long day. Well, it's 6 of them. I'll come back to the other one. Okay.
Sorry, he's only just done a long seminar on like last
I'm
month.
just going to say rhubarb. But if we know what the forms are, which is ironic, if we know what the forms are, then we can sort of put things into place that are going to sort of fix those things. So we can look at, okay, if we know what's your baseline fundamentals, okay, we're going to look at your lipids, kidney markers, liver markers, we're going to look at your red blood cell count, we're going to look at your total HSCRP, so we're going to look at what's your inflammation like, just really give a good baseline of you as a person. And just, let's say we saw some markers that need to be improved, obviously get them fixed. We're going to look at things like blood pressure, resting heart rate. I don't put too much value on things like HRV. I don't think it has much place in a bodybuilding population. I mean, we used to be quite big on the aura rings, but if your aura ring saying don't train, what are you going to tell a bodybuilder to not go train? It's not going to happen. So don't tend to look at those sorts of things. But that's kind of like the baseline fundamentals of what I would consider health. And then if you build on top of what's going to create a healthy athlete, we can obviously go down diet, obviously cardio again, the things which sound so obvious when they come out of my mouth, but the amount of bodybuilders we deal with that neglect all those things. So a baseline of what does good look like, and you can give some strategic targets like, okay, I want you doing at least an hour of cardio between 130 and 150 beats per minute a week. I want you to eat at least a kilo of fruits and vegetables per day. I want you to be doing some form of walking, again depending on the size of the individual and them, like let's say 6,000 to 10,000 steps per day, which I think is within the realm of any of our population, especially when we see quite a lot of drop off in all-cause mortality around that 8K a day mark, which is a fantastic point. And then we look at other things just like stress management. I think the amount of bodybuilders we've got who are chronically stressed, so putting something in place, whether that is something like somatic breathing techniques, whether that is...
Yeah, I'd love to talk a bit.
I'll pass it to you, mate. No.
Well, yeah, because I think ultimately what we're talking about in bodybuilding populations is like maximally facilitating that demand adaptation cycle, you know, and there's a magnitude by which on either side of that coin it can be facilitated, you know, and bodybuilders inherently I find are these goal-orientated, aggressive, goal-chasing individuals that are very demand-driven. You know, there's not an amount of training volume or cardio I could give some of my clients that they wouldn't do it. You know, so they can crank the demand side of the coin up crazy. The adaptation side of the coin, we don't have great control over. There are modalities that we can do that will improve our ability to drive adaptations. And actually, I intimately feel that physique athletes, this is something that's missing, and something that's been such a piece of gold for me working with my clients over the years, paying as much attention to things that would be forcefully parasympathetic, you could say, in nature, rather than forcefully sympathetic. You wouldn't believe how many of my clients I have using, like, have you heard of an app called Tate? Yeah, so using the Tate app before every meal, which is essentially self-regulated breathing practices. I just did a carousel post on my Instagram the other day where I went through the literature on the neurological shifts that you see in individuals that do self-regulated breathing. Big increase in GABA, increase in dopamine, decrease in glutamate, decrease in norepinephrine. Funnily enough, the exact physiological state that we want to maximize recoverability to resistance training responses, or any other thing that's inflammatory in nature, or drives up oxidative stress and things like this. Somatic exercises, like you mentioned, anything that's going to be kind of vagus nerve innervating or parasympathetic tone innervating. When have you ever seen bodybuilders talking about, yes, I'm going to eat every day my 6 meals, I'm going to do my cardio, I'm going to do my training, then I'm going to do my meditation?
That was one of the things that jumped out on your page. I mean, some of the things I wrote down, we'll go down the stoicism route and stuff, I'm sure, at some point.
Awesome.
Section there. But you had a post about breathing. You had a post about just being exposed to nature and sunlight, for example, and the benefits of that. Even the importance of avoiding decision fatigue.
Yeah.
All these, should we say, qualitative markers, like how do you know you're getting enough exposure to nature? Like it doesn't come up on your aura ring, right? But you're trying to push that you should be trying to recover hard, as hard as you train envelope. And it's that, to me, just coined like, okay, these guys, they know the game in that we probably don't need to be out there telling people take more drugs and train harder.
Right.
We need to be pushing that other envelope. And I think, what do you think are the biggest kind of pushbacks you get from your clientele then, who, as Dave would probably put, are all in until you say, are you eating whatever amount of greens a day? Are you walking every day? Are you getting outside? Are you meditating? Are you doing your nasal breathing exercises? Yes. When you hit that wall of, oh, I'm all in until this wall is here, how do you go about not convincing them, but just showing them that this is a way that genuinely leads to better results?
I just had this chat today doing Christian Koos, incredible classic bodybuilder. Where's Christian based again? Vienna. Is he still in Vienna?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, awesome classic bodybuilder, but very big, very strong guy. And he was saying, Joe, I can do more volume. It wasn't saying, please give me more volume. He's like, if you want, I can do more training volume. And the easiest way, I think, to acutely, because chronically is a different thing, because I think chronically you can just show their physique. You say, if I'm doing my job properly as a coach, we've got this kind of X grams of muscle gain per month or whatever. Let's see if you're doing it chronically, if you apply yourself to all of these things. But acutely, let's say within a single week, objective data markers are going to be your easiest metric. Like if we want to know if a training program works, well, if that demand and adaptation is occurring, i.e. you resistance train, so you place the demand, an adaptation of skeletal muscle hypertrophy is going to occur. If that adaptation has occurred, you should be able to go in and do more to elicit a new demand. So progressive overload, progressive tension overload. That's only going to occur if your program works. Chronically, it makes more sense because you can generate progressive overload short term with a lot of stupid things, right? Like novelty or skill acquisition and things like that. But he's been doing this program for a long time, so it's a good example. If you're still progressively overloading on this volume and this frequency with this exercises, after 8 weeks, you are still growing muscle. Could you do more? Maybe. But then you would limit the repeatability of this. Maybe that's less weeks prior to needing a deload. So at least we can see objectively this week that the phase-specific goal of that microcycle of that week was nailed. Tick your volumes fine. Same thing, like let's say we're trying to set an objective marker on nervous system regulation. We use like resting heart rate, something like that. If we've managed to reduce your resting heart rate from 75 to 68, great, doing your work. If not, we need to assess it and do something. It's the same with like energy balance control. If you're trying to lose 1% body weight per week, but you've lost 0.5%, you're going to need to decrease your calories or increase your expenditure, aren't you? You know, so phase-specific goals across all those metrics, which is why we have quite sort of comprehensive coaching sheets. It can sometimes annoy people initially, but I think when you start to, in each check and go through each objective metric and have a phase-specific goal, because bodybuilders love goals, don't they? Mm-hmm. You know, we're going to lose this much weight a week. I want you to do this much progressive overload on these exercises with this progression scheme, and we want to see this on your resting heart rate and this on your blood pressure. It gets bodybuilders excited.
The other point I was going to add to what Joe mentioned there is obviously he's talking about the short term with the client. I like to sort of project out and look at success previously. So look at these top bodybuilders, look at Chris Bumstead, look at Ronnie, look at all these guys. Were they the most stressed, jacked up guys all the time? No, they were very chilled. If you looked at any documentaries, these guys were chilled. I'm not saying all the time, they ripped it in the gym, but they were very chilled outside of that. So if your attitude is, I'm 100% on nothing, I always think you're probably going to be nothing more often than not, because you can't hold on to that. You can't stay up there all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there about being 100% in the gym, because a well-regulated nervous system is not one that's relaxed all the time. It's one that can mobilize from sympathetic to parasympathetic, or if you want to go further down the line of polyvagal stuff, you know, dorsal, vagal, whatever. If you can get in the gym and go absolutely sympathetic animal, and then as soon as you're done, be like the Buddha, you're winning. That's perfect. And the more parasympathetic that you can be between bouts of training, the more sympathetic tone you'll be able to generate in your resistance training sessions. So I honestly think nervous system health, autonomic nervous system health, more than anything, is a key factor that physique athletes have left untouched.
Mm-hmm. Right. My following point for that, which you've kind of already gone into a little bit there, which I think is great, is like, you know, type of people that maybe Dave and myself get exposed to, if we're talking like powerlifters, especially if we're talking like multiply and stuff like that, painfully aware of neurological fatigue and management, right? You put triple ply squat suit on and do a couple of sets, or even one set, you're aware of what your nervous system can do and also how long it takes to come back from. Mm-hmm. Do you think that maybe those two worlds need to learn from each other a little bit more? Because, you know, the stereotypical bodybuilder will be eating their 6 meals a day, and in terms of maybe the muscular system and that type of thing will be probably extremely in tuned and very good. Whereas maybe, like you said, on the neurological side of things, maybe just passively not thinking about it or thinking it's not important. Whereas that can almost get flipped in the performance world, where they'll eat ho-hos every day and whatever else, but they'll make sure they sleep 10 hours a night and are in that mode. So for that one set, they can just go.
Yeah.
You know, so how do you go about kind of saying to these guys, look, just do this nasal breathing for 10 minutes at the end of your session, or do this daily meditation? How often do you kind of find them coming back maybe a week or two later and going, well, fuck it, you were right?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, all the time.
I think it's meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a really weird example, but you see where I'm going with. On the first time Trump got elected, do you remember the polls were saying he's going to get stomped and everything like that? Because everyone was saying, you're an idiot if you vote Trump, right? He's saying that's what's going to happen. So people get their opinions to themselves and they weren't going to tell you. That's because they've been told what to think. I think we're in that world where opposing camps have got all these ideas. So we just go, rather than actually telling people that's wrong, don't do that, we're going to meet you where you are. Okay, you're doing all this stuff fantastically well. Here's a way we could probably improve your performance. And it's going to get people away out of their corner, a bit more kind of open rather than defensive, and they're more likely to employ that strategy that you actually want to put in place. Because I'm sure you're the same as me. If you tell me, you're wrong, Matt, I'm like, fuck you. I'm not going to listen. But if you kind of explain to me how it's going to benefit me and actually show that you care, and you show me this for a reason, I'm probably going to employ it. And when you start to deal with people like that, they're likely to come out and actually put this thing in place. And I mean, I told Joe about this Tate app. I was like, check this app out, and I've given it to all my clients. So like recency bias through the roof. But everyone, I put it in. They're like, I'm stressed all the time. I said, look, if you're stressed all the time, how's it affecting your life? Pretty badly. Okay, how's your digestion? Yeah, it's pretty bad. How's your sleep? Awful. Okay, just it's going to sound a bit wacky. Just try this app in just once a day. Tell me you don't feel better, and everyone's like, shit, yeah, I do. And it's like, it's understanding them. I'm not saying do this thing because you're wrong. I'm saying this is how it's actually going to help you. And I think that just communication element when you're dealing with a person at the end of the day, because we can talk about powerlifter, bodybuilder, still a dude that wants to get better. If you can help them on that journey, they're probably going to listen and accept it.
Outside of that app, what would be the trackable metrics that you're going to use to be able to determine if it's yay or nay?
Unfortunately, we don't really have a reliable way to know if we're expressing like parasympathetic tone or sympathetic tone, but resting heart rate is probably the best one, or quite honestly, the way that you feel. If you're used to being in a sympathetically innervated state, and then let's say you go on YouTube and look at some like vagus nerve activating exercise or something like that, you will notice a robust shift in the way that you feel, in your sociability, in your digestion, in your sleep quality, in your heart rate. And I mentioned these kind of chronically sympathetically stressed individuals because especially contest prep bodybuilders, like that's what they are. And a lot of these people haven't been relaxed at any time of the day for a long period. And after doing this for a decade, which isn't a long time, I'm sure, compared to you guys, but I've watched a lot of competitors over the years almost develop symptoms that are, we were talking about this the other day, that are like analogous to chronic fatigue syndrome or ME or anxiety disorders, depression disorders. And, you know, you see, or histamine intolerance, you know, this mast cell activation issues. And I'm talking absolutely hypothetically here. I could be completely wrong, but I do think that this is mechanistically driven. The mechanism of action is consistent nervous system dysregulation, where they're ended up stuck in this fight, flight, or freeze mode for so long, in absence of ever taking time to almost pay back the sympathetic debt, you could say.
It is a really hard question to answer, Dave, because you said, how do people know? And you can look at, say, like a HRV score, and it might just be trash anyway. Resting heart rate might just be jacked up all the time. Then you say to someone, how do you feel? They're like, I feel great, because they've never known how bad they actually feel. So they don't know like point of reference. So it's like, how do you step back from that? But I think that it's going to sound like such a airy-fairy answer, but when you actually chat to someone, like, how do you feel all the time? Like, you'll get the sense of what someone is. Like, I'm sure you've had times where you've been like a burnout and you thought, I'm okay. But like, I think if someone sat down, you're like, I'm fucking struggling. And like, not like maybe in the sense of a meltdown, but like, I am struggling. My heart rate's up, my sleep's gone to shit, my digestion's gone. Those are the subjective variables that we need to look at, rather than trying to find this objective marker of like heart rate, because that might just not tell you the full picture. So I think
they could be on meds controlling that too.
Exactly that, right? So there's so many factors there, which I think, because we can't just put a pin in it and say, oh, that's a sign that you're stressed, it's a very hard one to track. And then, of course, when we start saying things like try some breath work, people are like, nah, fuck off.
Yeah, that's where I'm going is if it's quantifiable, like your progress in the gym, then it would be easier to.
Well, the translation is generally, so if you see a significant drop off in things like norepinephrine and cortisol, you will start losing body weight, you know, because that adrenal dysfunction that I'm sure Austin probably yet listened to. I'm going to listen to it. When Austin was on here the other day, I'm sure he talks a lot about adrenal issues because that's his speciality. You know, if you see that adrenal dysfunction and somebody is running super high cortisol and they drop a chunk of that off, you are going to shift off a lot of extracellular fluid pretty damn quickly, you know.
Well, we had an example yesterday. We were chatting about one of my clients in the gym, and I just said, like, have a look at this physique. Stressed straight away, you can just see it looks like a stressed physique, and the client doesn't know that. Have you heard the analogy of the boiling frog? You just turn the temperature up on the frog, and it's boiling.
Using my favourite analogy.
Yeah, I think so. Good. He's studying while I'm studying his. We spent too much time together. But you basically don't know how bad they feel. But I sort of put off a bit of stressor, and he's like, "Oh my god, I look so much better, so much stronger in the gym." He's getting through his stuff, and he's making progress. But is it kind of like the progress you would expect? And that's where the art of coaching, I think, comes in as well. Like, what does good look like? And then let's say know what good looks like. They might just think what they're doing is great.
So, and it's intricate because that's like periodization as well across like all vectors, like a well-timed mini cut. Have you ever seen somebody have a well-timed mini cut and start progressively overloading like crazy out of nowhere? You know, that's the frog in the water analogy. They've been so stressed from this high degree of caloric consumption for so long. When they finally reel it back, give themselves a little bit of less stress on the digestive system that is intimately linked to parasympathetic necessity, you know, rest and digest. You need a certain amount of parasympathetic tone to be able to efficiently digest food. If you now require less and you're covering your bases, and now suddenly all of these adaptations are rolling in, you know, all of these stressors need to be balanced, just like the beginning of this conversation, you know, the demand adaptation cycle. There has to be equilibrium. but bodybuilders are most typically cranking off this side, especially with regard to PEDs, which is where I'm more kind of intimately concerned, where Matt mentioned one of the negative, like the deleterious health outcomes of PEDs is the brain. And I've spoken at length about this, more so ironically at length, about how much we don't know. Like, we don't really have a clue on what the neurotoxicity outcomes of androgens are, but they're frightening. And
good.
Yeah, the more research that comes out, the worse it looks. I've got some hypotheses of what I think it may be from like cell line models and rodent models and things. I think, and I'll just kind of put this out there with the caveat that this is just where my brain is currently at. And we obviously haven't got lobotomized androgen users yet.
Give it time.
Yeah. I think there's probably some kind of glutamate dysfunction with excessive glutamate, maybe glutamate excitotoxicity, leading to very high excitatory signaling, low inhibitory signaling, so probably low GABA, low dopamine as well. And if you look at other pathologies that present similarly, like anxiety is one of them. Like anxieties are very common. How many bodybuilders have anxiety issues? Or like low GABA often presents like low GABA, low oxytocin, like lack of affection with loved ones, lack of sociability. Isn't that a contest prep bodybuilding?
It just sounds like a trend.
You know,
I want to add to that. Is that not probably most people right now? You know, we're talking like the type of society that we live in, the daily, like is probably everyone not suffering some kind of glutamate activity right now.
Probably.
Oh yeah, especially if they're all prescribed dopamine agonists.
Right. And then, you know, it's added into the processed foods, the fast foods, you know, it's all the blue light exposure and things like that. And then you take a contest prep bodybuilder and then they're taking glutamine supplements, they're taking protein powders that are really high in glutamate, and you add all that into the mix too. And when you start experiencing that, then what are some of the other lifestyle things that you maybe try to put in to get these guys and girls to realize, okay, you think you feel good, but let's just try and shift that to this being what is normal to you, so that we have a better perspective now when things actually go south.
Well, we've mentioned some of the modalities to, if we're talking like the actual mechanisms at play to shift up GABA, to shift up dopamine, to push down norepinephrine and glutamate and etc. I've had really good success in the last couple of years with employing a robust, I don't even know if it's the right word, nootropics protocol with my competitors. I hesitate to say nootropics because it's not like here's a series of compounds that are going to give you this amazing executive functional verbal fluency and things like that, but more so to support that hypothesis is, okay, if we've got excessive glutamate, let's look at things like glutamate quenching or positive allosteric modulators of GABA, or increase the density of a GABA receptor, or whatever it may be, like imoxapine or saffron or rhodiola, maybe KSM-66 if they tolerate it well, lithium orotate, which is excellent for quenching norepinephrine and excitatory signaling in general, potent antioxidants as well, metformin, melatonin. Bromontane is one that I'm very interested in, especially intranasal bromontane. The actoprotectors, I think, as their whole mechanistic outcome of upregulating tyrosine hydroxylase and upregulating GABA in absence of tolerance or downregulation. So no direct agonism, I think, is they're seriously interesting to me. The actoprotectors.
If I'm sat here as a non-competitive bodybuilder, you know, and you're talking about stuff that I believe is pretty prevalent in our society outside of this population too. What symptoms am I looking for? Where then I go and I listen to that and I go, maybe I need to try one or two of those and see how I feel.
I think a lot of it's going to be some level of anxiety, probably. And I hate to use that word because everyone's got anxiety, everyone's anxious.
Well, everybody's going to define it differently.
Exactly
too.
that. But I think everyone knows when they just feel a little bit unsettled, and maybe like racing thoughts, a bit inability to sleep. Maybe they got their circadian rhythm's not great. They struggle to wake up, struggle to go to bed. Perhaps like even little things like digestion might be off. There's little things that we might notice downstream of all the having a high level of stress. So that would be the kind of things I would first and foremost look at, is just someone's general subjective well-being. How are you coping? What's your ability to focus? What's your ability to switch off? What's your ability to wake up, to go to sleep? That's obviously there's a million things that can be affected by that. But what I would also, probably the way I would look at it, to be honest, is, you know how we would look at general things you put in as a kind of stack design support for a client. Do exactly the same thing for brain health. Is we put things in. I remember that sixth one, by the way, it was blood. So got there in the end. Right. We put things in to protect all these against these 6 toxicities, and we think of things like, we're a big fan of using an ARB for not just blood pressure but angiotensin 2, which has a number of downstream impacts, but putting in things like antioxidants, like NAT, glutathione, all that sort of stuff. Brain health should fall into that as well. And I think it's not necessarily wait until you see the signs. I think just get ahead of it. Just don't even think, oh, what are the signs of that? You know what, I'm just going to go ahead and just put these things in place. Because a lot of you is 99% of the time, you're not going to feel worse. You're only going to feel better. And it's going to have some neuroproductivity alongside of that, which is ultimately what we want. Because I think you see so many bodybuilders, yep, I'm getting my echo, fantastic, love that you're doing that. Getting my bloods, fantastic. Don't give a second thought to what's happening up here. And they're like, oh, that'd be fine. Well, by the time you realise it's too late, so you want to get ahead of that. So the same way they're taking all these supplements, don't wait for the warning signs when you do feel anxious, do feel all these things. And so I was going to go on a bit of a monologue here, but the one last thing I'd say is we're all in this position where we probably neglect ourselves till it's too late. I don't know if anyone who's had a health scare. I've had a health scare before where that would maybe reevaluate a lot of the decisions I was making with my health. And I realised, unless I look after me, if I break down, my life breaks down. But a lot of people just act like they're invincible, and they go, I'm not going to worry about my breath work. No, I haven't got time to go for a walk. Sleep, fuck it. And it's like, well, actually, we need to start to prioritise and just flip the needle towards more of that. And I think we'd have a lot less of the problems in society where you haven't got people just numbing themselves consistently. Maybe start to prioritise yourself. Yes, put the nootropics in, but also look at your lifestyle, how that contributes to those things as well. That's going to help your brain, life, everything, but it's going to massively help your physique outcomes alongside of that.
Very well said.
Yeah, maybe what I would say as well, because you asked about the kind of phenotype of individual that may think, oh, this is for me, is rather than generalize it as anxiety, generalize it as sympathetic tone, I think, and try to provide an explanation of what that may be. There's a great book actually by Dr. Stephen Porges called Anchored. I'm pretty sure he's the guy that pioneered polyvagal theory. Really, it's a highly contested theory, but the exercises work. That's what the research says. They seem to work, but it might not be because of this reason, but whatever, they work.
Isn't that the same with a lot of things?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't care. Who cares? Yeah.
Do your clientele care why?
Yeah.
You know?
Because anxiety is a matter of perception, isn't it? I think. You know, some people will have excessive sympathetic tone, but it will be being excited and ready to do the thing. You know, when I'm at jiu-jitsu and I'm highly sympathetically innovated in a role, it's fantastic and I feel great. When I have to go and speak in front of an audience and I'm exactly the same amount of sympathetically innovated, it's horrible, you know. And also your ability to mobilize from sympathetic tone, I think, is an important thing to recognize. You know, can I be sat here talking to you now? I'm obviously a lot more animated than I'm going to be when I'm laying at home with my wife. Am I going to be able to walk out of this room and go, and my heart rate tick down, you know, because now it's dead on 100. You know, if I'm talking to my wife at home, that better be more like 50, 60, you know?
So when, you know, we're talking about these mitigation strategies and stuff like that, which I think absolutely should be pioneered more, and I commend you for doing that. When you're generally intaking new clients and you're trying to put them on this new protocol, model, you know, whatever terminology we want to use, what are the most common bad practices that you're running into that you have to undo, other than the more is more? You know, what are the things you most often have to go, that doesn't work?
About brain health or across the board?
Let's go, sorry, so for PEDs, when you're taking on clients and you start controlling those variables for them, outside of just the attitude of more is better, what are the really common misconceptions that you're running into that where you're like, oh, that myth needs to die, or, you know, whatever?
My biggest fear when I take on a client is, have you had an echocardiogram? That's my biggest fear straight off the bat, because people go, I can't afford it, it's too expensive. And I was like, okay, that's how much it's going to cost you if you die? Because if you've got, say, a valve defect, some underlying condition, some congenital heart problem, and you take drugs, that's going to exacerbate that consistently.
You always think it's never going to be you.
We've had friends that have died that had an underlying issue.
Yeah, one of my best friends a couple of years ago.
Last year.
I literally spoke to him on the Thursday.
It was last year.
Was it last year?
Last year.
On the Friday, I got a message from his fiance. They're about to be married 2 weeks later. Gone into hospital. He's just had a heart attack.
And he had a congenital issue that could have been picked up.
Yeah.
And we consistently push this button because people think, oh, it's a cost. I was like, yes, it is.
And this was not a high dose PED user. This was a TRT guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know,
this is the thing. That's probably the one that concerns me the most. That the health side of things, blood work. Oh, it's too expensive. And I've had it before. God, a bit tight on money. I can't afford my blood work. And I was like, that's one thing I really want to push into the ground. That and not eating any fruits and vegetables. That seems to be this thing going around at the moment. I don't know why it is. They're like, I'm pushing up. I'm taking all these drugs. I'm not going to be concerned about antioxidant support, fiber for one. Maybe they watched too much Liver King and seen he's jacked. They're like, I'm going to go for this guy. But there's something about it where they just sort of almost like neglect of the diet, even for bodybuilders. Which
it's comedy, man. The fruit and vegetable thing is comedy because it's obviously your number one way of quenching oxidative stress. You know, the number one thing that you're pounding at with everything that you do. And it's probably the most common thing with clients I've had over the years that have been like, Joe, I can't do that. Like 1.2 kilos of fruit and vegetables a day. But then every single time without fail, my digestion's never been this good. I've never been so hungry between it because people see the food volume and the fiber content and they think that's going to slow everything down. When, you know, yeah, you have to pay attention to soluble and insoluble ratios and whatnot and, you know, make sure everything's done properly. But, you know, it's going to increase gastric emptying rate, improve gastric motility and things like that. It's the number one thing. Is like,
I'm laughing because I've had it before when people are like, I've literally all I've done is put a kilo of fruits and vegetables. They're like, you're a fucking wizard. And I was
I've
like,
never felt so good. My skin's never looked so good.
Am I a
you
wizard? Am I a wizard, really? But that's what always makes me chuckle. But
Sorry.
No.
I'll answer your question about the PEDs as well. So the most common things among my stable of clients, which is these days, it's normally like national level or pro competitors, male and female. The most typical one is, I don't want to say non-intelligent focus or structure to stack design. And when I say stack design, let's say just androgens here. We're talking, you know, some amount of testosterone, some amount of a DHT derivative, maybe some amount of a 19 norandrogen as well. And just kind of put together in just this way, you know, not really that they've worked up to it to structure it to what their needs are. And then the use of ancillaries to control for the off-target issues that are resultant from the improper management of that. And that would be the most common. And rather than using too much, it's not that common. You know, most of my clients will be somewhere in the 1 to 2 gram range at peak load, given that they're competing on national pro kind of stage. And very rarely do I have to move their dosages down, but very commonly it will be moving around of the doses of what they're on to reduce or remove the ancillaries that are going to be deleterious long term, most notably AIs.
Mm-hmm.
And building in prophylactics like you mentioned of like telmisartan and metformin, maybe including more growth hormone or more insulin, because people, you know, if you look at the clinical dosages of growth hormone that's used, for example, in populations, it's like they're insane. 16 units, 30 units. And then look at the clinical dosages that are used in androgens. And we're using like 10 times on the androgen and then like 10% on the GH.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, actually, we can generate some like good safety testing outcomes by looking at these. And actually, that 10 units of GH, not that I'm advocating for that, but it's going to be far less deleterious than 3 grams of testosterone, you know?
Sure. So there are kind of some cards that they're pushing too hard, for sure.
Yeah.
And then other cards that they're not.
What I was going to mention was you see it a lot at the moment. You get a lot of people who are scared of things like insulin, which we can come on to in a bit. They're terrified of insulin, but they're like, right, I'm going to take this drug that has never been tested for human use. I heard some influencer talking about this peptide. I want to take that. I'm like, I'm a bit confused. Like, you got this drug that's got no safety data, might have been just tested in rats, hasn't been hasn't been ever studied. We don't even know what dose we need to take in humans. But they're like, fuck, I can't take insulin. I was like, do you drink coffee? And they're like, yeah. I was like, LD50 of coffee is greater than that of, so it was lower than that of insulin. So like, you're more likely to kill yourself with a caffeine overdose.
Haven't you done that though?
Tried to,
Well, not kill yourself. Nearly.
Actually
Nearly
tried to
did.
kill myself.
Yeah.
I got hospitalised with a caffeine overdose because I took caffeine powder thinking it was creatine because I'm a fucking idiot.
Oh, that'll do it.
That will do it.
Yeah.
That was not a peak moment.
I accidentally took 250 milligrams of Yohimbine once. Yeah, that was mad.
Have you come down yet?
I was like somewhere in between worrying about dying and having the weirdest sex of my life.
Don't look at me when you say
That should be somewhere everyone should strive to
You know,
get
it was
to
like-
once, though, surely.
the most unreal libido coupled with fear of death. Yeah.
Nirvana right there, yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, this was like before Yohimbine was a thing, and like not many people were using it. And I got raw from China, and it was like my first time using milligram scales.
You the wrong. He's all marked
Yeah,
on the
I didn't
scales.
tear it properly. Yeah, it was rough day that was. I was laying there thinking, oh, I must be mobilising so much fat. That's the only way I could like get myself through it.
I'm gonna be so shredded when I come down from this.
She was going, your eyes are so red. They were like this table,
I
man.
just said to her, I think I've killed myself.
Yeah.
Good. Let's go down the insulin route then, since
Rather than our fucking idiot.
since you mentioned it. What roadblocks or good practices are you kind of looking at there with insulin?
We tend to see the roadblocks mainly people's perception of it. I think people see this drug that's going to kill them instantly. And I mean, unless you're type 1 diabetic, which obviously is not going to kill you instantly, but it obviously can be a factor, you're not really going to run into those problems. It's going to synergize with anabolics, with GH in a fantastic way. It's going to offer some, certainly in the form of like Lantus and things like that, it's going to offer you some sort of load off your pancreas, going to offer you some fantastic nutrient partitioning alongside that kind of peri-workout nutrition. Offer some really unique benefits there, and it's going to allow us to maybe go to a situation with anabolics, GH, and insulin is like 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. So it's going to do some great stuff, but people are like, I couldn't take that because I'm going to die. You know, like, where's that come from? And I think they've heard someone on YouTube or something say that's going to be the case. When if we look at the case study reports, the actual ability to kill yourself with these drugs is very, very low. It's only ever intentional. Like, I've overdosed on insulin one time. Like I inject myself with the wrong. I woke up one morning.
Yeah, called me, bro. What do I do?
I messaged you. I said I think I've
Eat some carbs.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
injected the wrong Lantus. I thought I'd injected Lantus. I was half asleep. And I injected Nova Rapid 30 units, and I was like, again, I probably shouldn't be talking about safer use drugs when I've obviously been an idiot myself.
Yeah, but who else is better to say
Yeah, exactly.
Don't do that. Like, the thing is, you know what to do. I was never in any danger. It was just a stupid thing to do.
Yeah, the LD50 of Lantus is 1,000 units, and I'm not sure what it's like over here because I've seen you guys get vials, but everything that we get is in a pen, 300 unit pen. So unless you're pinning more than 3 pens,
And it's 60 turns on a pen, I believe.
Yeah.
So you have to really get
and
it.
look, if someone's watching this, they're going to the comments like, insulin kills people and stuff. Insulin has killed people, mostly type 1 diabetics. It's pretty damn hard to kill yourself. Can you go hypo and pass out? Yes. Can you have a seizure? Yes. Is your pancreas going to kick out glucagon to bring your blood glucose back up? Yes. You're not going to die. It's not a good thing, though. It's not nice to go super hypo. It's not good for your muscle, that's for sure. It's going to crank up muscle protein breakdown crazy to cleave some glucagon. But what it is very well tolerated at reasonable dosages and can be used prophylactically as a health management tool. Running extremely high blood glucose, especially in the presence of high exogenous growth hormone, like a lot of bodybuilders or especially powerlifters and strength athletes are doing, living in a state of constant insulin resistance. If you can prophylactically use a basal insulin like Lantus at true therapeutic dosages, which is going to be in like the 10 to 20, maybe 30 if you're under real high food caloric load, it's going to do you a favour.
Especially when you think about oxidative stress, atherosclerotic risk. Imagine a super heavyweight bodybuilder's diet at that point. You're talking about like your endothelial function's gone out the window. So when you talk about your risk factors and using prophylactic, a lot of these anti-aging clinics are using basal insulin.
Yeah, I see that here in the States a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of basal insulin use.
Outside of pushing muscle growth to new levels, what do you see then in terms of like resting blood sugar, A1C and stuff like that when you start implementing smart insulin usage with individuals?
I mean, I'd like to think it shouldn't be the main focus of keeping someone's blood glucose in range. Obviously, we're talking about using it to kind of take off a bit of you don't want to redline the pancreas. We're talking taking a bit of load off. Your blood glucose control and everything should be done via kind of being at reasonable body fat. I mean, we did a seminar quite recently and people said, what's the biggest tip of staying healthy? And I was like, don't get fat. Basically, I was like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it kind of tongue in cheek, but I'm also being legit with that as well. Keep it a reasonable level of body fat. Keep your cardio in. Eat well. Your blood glucose is probably going to stay in a good range.
To be specific about, sorry to cut you off there, just before you go on, to be specific about insulin sensitivity as well. You know, blood glucose is a marker that has utility. It's useful for us to track, maybe chronically more so than acutely, but it is only one side of the coin. You do also have to look at your blood insulin. I typically use a HOMA-IR test with my clients, homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance, because I've had clients that present, like, you remember Brandon Dacruz? His like blood glucose are always super high, but he's peeled all the time. So goes and gets a HOMA-IR, his blood insulin's super low, run that through that program, and he's actually really insulin sensitive. You know, so just looking at blood glucose and being like, yeah, man, I've got a 3.3 blood glucose. It's awesome. And I pin 200 units of Lantus every day to keep it there. You know, if you've got mega high blood insulin, it's no good.
Yeah, hyperinsulinemia is not a good place to be. You're going to get long-term insulin resistance from that. So
yeah, so if you are, for example, the reason I say this is because some people will say, well, I program my insulin use based on my blood glucose. It's like, well, that could be a never-ending scale. You know, as you get more insulin resistant, you just take more insulin and become more and more hyperinsulinemic, and it just sort of falsely push your blood glucose down. You have to be managing these things with at least a fasted insulin to pair it with your own fasted blood glucose, if not a HOMA-IR.
And do you think that then becomes more and more important, as you mentioned, like growth hormone is maybe a card that doesn't get pushed hard enough, but obviously that has effects on insulin and blood sugar and stuff. So if people are going down the route of pushing those things up higher, which from my knowledge, you may well correct me here and please do, like as people turn pro and can afford to invest more in their cycles, growth hormone tends to be one of those things that gets pushed up more.
You know what I find quite typically is that people go through this process where they do push up growth hormone. They might start playing with more like exotic ranges, like 15 units and 20 units, and they all seem to eventuate back down to 8 to 10.
Bankrupt.
Well, the anecdote across the board, and growth hormones are a really interesting one. In fact, I've never seen a PED educator like, have you heard of Chester Rockwell? Yeah, so this is a name most people have never heard of, anonymous guy. He was on the Blast and Cruise forum as a private forum back in the day. One of these places that I'll always owe a lot to Chester because he was a mega evidence-based guy, but always anonymous. He wrote for MesoRx these amazing growth hormone articles, like growth hormone protocol for hypertrophy. And you cannot imagine the intricacy of that molecule in its relationship to hypertrophy or lipolysis. So it's not particularly clear if there is a dose response, but to what degree that is, and what downstream cascades on systemic IGF-1 versus autocrine and paracrine IGF-1, and whether that systemic IGF-1 is a negative feedback regulator of autocrine and paracrine IGF-1, things like this. It gets messy on the pharmacology. But part of that being, and what he postulated, was that there is a dose by which systemic IGF-1 would be so high that there would be a negative feedback impact on, when I say autocrine, paracrine, IGF-1, for anybody that's listening, it's like inside and outside the cell, like the skeletal muscle cell, which is where we want it. And androgens increase mRNA expression of IGF-1 in the muscle cells, so that's why that synergy is created. But there likely is a dose of growth hormone where you get a negative return on investment. And it's interesting to watch that anecdotally people, in my experience anyway, other people's experience might differ, they drift back down to this 8 to 10 unit per day, like maximum, and any more than that's just an unnecessary amount of like aldosterone increase in fluid retention and things like this, you know.
Growth hormone seems to be the one for me where there seems to be like the most numerous amounts of like mythical protocols where like if you take it at night on a full moon whilst you're eating a banana or something like it does. Do you, in your experience, do you find that most of that just really needs to go out the way, and it's just like, you know, you say that 8 to 10 range there, like that's 90% of it. Like, does timing come into it in your opinion?
I think what I'd say is, so we'd have to differentiate hypertrophy versus fat loss firstly.
Of course.
Very different conditions of what the downstream mechanisms would sort of result in. So we know the fat loss impact of growth hormone is driven by its ability to mobilize free fatty acids. And there has to be certain conditions for that to take place maximally, because presence of blood insulin, blood amino acids, blood dietary fatty acids, blood glucose, that will inhibit substantially the amount of free fatty acids that can be mobilized at any one time, which means that you do want to take it in a fasted state. So that would be the reason for at least that bolus dose of growth hormone. Now, luckily for us, there is a study that we went through on the Physique Collective forum. I've done some videos on it where they look at the dose response of free fatty acid mobilization from a single bolus dose of growth hormone. And bearing in mind this was intravenous, I did some sort of rough calculations on what the equivalent would be subcutaneous. And it's looking about 1.5 units per 100 kilos of body weight is where you're going to top out at least the free fatty acid mobilization effects of growth hormone. So let's say you're a female and you only want the fat loss impact and you weigh 50 kilos. Well, 0.75 units fasted once a day, done. But there are other impacts that would somewhat result in improved body composition, like its impacts on metabolic flexibility, for example. So that's not reliant on the free fatty acid mobilization. That could just be, over the course of a day, you're generating more insulin resistance to adipocytes, so you're going to get more glucose disposal into the muscle cell rather than, adipocyte disposal of whatever substrate and things like that. So it's not to say more wouldn't result in improved body composition over time, but at least just looking at that acute window of fat loss, that's where you're going to maximize out on that. So that's what I would say for fat loss. For hypertrophy, if we're going to go down these hypotheticals that Chester Rockwell postulated that seem to be well represented in data, although a lot of people disagree, I think there are roles to systemic IGF-1 in hypertrophy. I think I heard Dr. Scott the other day say that he's more enlightened than he was previously on what that would be. I need to catch up with Scott on that. But I wouldn't be a fan of this sort of bolus dosing every other day structure, because that is going to push up systemic IGF-1 aggressively. And if that is a negative feedback regulator of local IGF-1, then you're not going to be getting your best bang for your buck from that. In fact, if we want to really go down on that and say, okay, it likely is a negative feedback regulator, then some form of microdosing would be best, maybe twice per day or 3 times a day if you can be bothered to do. That's going to depend on the dose, isn't it? Like if you're doing 10 units, I'd probably do 5 and 5,
With that fat loss benefit that you're talking about, the fasting, when they're looking at the upregulation of the fatty acid mobilization, is there like a time window in which that as in, like, is there an argument to be made for doing that multiple times through the day to get that?
It's quite a long area under the curve, and it peaks quite late.
So it's 6 to 8 hours.
4 to 6 hours is like variability of peak. So what I would typically do is have my clients inject that before bed, and they're going to have significant free fatty acid mobilization when they wake up. And then you can use other compounds that drive synergies for the whole lipolysis process. Clenbuterol works on fatty acid oxidation. Your himbine is also going to push up free fatty acid mobilization.
As long as you get your micrograms right.
Yeah, don't buy raws from China and weigh it out. Not at least with, oh God, don't do that with clenbuterol. Tachycardia, see. Your himbine, your injectable L-carnitine, if you want to push the shuttle in the transport of the fatty acids and whatnot, there's... we were talking about growth hormone time.
No. You mentioned L-carnitine and stuff like that. Like that stuff is kind of bleeding into bodybuilding more and more now. Do you see that as being like kind of bodybuilding like 3.0, where people are now taking advantage of? We've maxed out. You guys are doing a lot to make sure people are getting the most out of those drugs that have been around for longer, but we're not going to invent another Deca or whatever, right? So do you see these peptides kind of coming in now and playing a big role long term, or do you think it's going to be more of a fad or something that is just like an ancillary player?
Hey guys, if you're enjoying what you're watching, make sure to take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe.
I think with L-carnitine, it's a nice to have. It's a catalyst. I would look at. I'd sort of say it's a. The biggest consideration I have with L-carnitine is, do you mind jabbing it every day? Because a lot of people get a pip. What reason I say that is it's not going to be this game changer of a drug. It's not going to be anything like that. I think it's a nice to have, and we tend to see potentially a benefit. But again, how do you sort of pick that one element out of a complete snack design thing? That was the thing that made the difference. It's hard to say. Theoretically, is it going to make a difference? Yeah, it should do. Should definitely make an impact on fat loss for sure. Nutrient transport, potentially beneficial nutrient partitioning, even in the gaining phase. I think when you say peptides in general, I think there's going to be that's where we're seeing probably a lot more movement. There's certainly some drugs which have come out. I've talked about not having any human safety data. There's a couple of drugs that look potentially promising. Let's find out in 5 to 10 years where we are with that. That could change the landscape significantly. Where we are right now, I wouldn't ever sit there and say L-carnitine was that drug.
No, because it's not blowing anyone's mind. I think it's an incredible molecule with so many, it's like multi-pronged mechanisms. Like we were talking about bromontane earlier, its ability to upregulate dopamine receptors. Like L-carnitine and what it does to dopamine receptor density is fascinating. But I mean, the best thing about L-carnitine is it's benign. It's an amino acid.
Yeah.
You know, especially injectable, you're not going to have any issues with TMAO or anything like that. I mean, alongside bromontane, you run those two, that's as close to as comprehensive as a dopamine regeneration stack as you're going to get that doesn't have any costs. It's great for fertility, excellent for nutrient partitioning, for fat oxidation, but with no cost really. Unless you like spank it, yeah, there could be some thyroidal axis issues. But, you know, if you're at the 300 to 600 milligram per day, it's fantastic.
Do you see maybe the peptides coming in and allowing people to tolerate more? As in, let's say, for example, I'm using high-dose glutathione as like an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. I'm using DSIP to make sure I can sleep whilst I'm on 800 milligrams of tren. Do you know what I mean? Do you see them almost being facilitators?
Oh, yeah, having a
as opposed to enhancing the results themselves, if you know what I'm saying.
A comprehensive antioxidant and a comprehensive anti-inflammatory supplementation stack design, you could say, is absolutely going to allow you to get away with more because you're paying more into the recoverability versus the stimulus side. And they can always move in tandem with each other.
I always think what's going to tap you out of a gaining phase. Let's say gaining phase. What's going to tap you out? It's going to be illness, injury, want or desire, and then your health markers. Something's going to make you tap. And we'd like to think for most people, let's just hope it's going to be like the appetite. One is going to be one. If we make it the appetite, it's going to go. You've probably got a pretty long gaining phase. If it's your blood markers are gone to shit because you haven't been looking after your health, like we obviously spoke about, if you're facilitating better health markers by the use of the things you just mentioned, you're going to gain more muscle, quite simply, just from the fact that you're not going to have that tap out on that phase earlier. So anything that's going to prolong it is a winner. And obviously, you can't get strong, you can't get big if you're injured or ill. So if you're taking care of that one, that's going to be a fantastic way to keep it going.
With you mentioned there, you know, what taps you out in a gaining phase, for example. So when you're looking at your protocols and best practices, how do they differ then in an off season, either with regards to what you prescribe or maybe the emphasis on health and blood markers versus in season? Like how do those approaches differ for you guys in terms of what are your emphases, whether it's in terms of compounds that are used or your markers for keeping someone in terms of the safety window health-wise? Like obviously in prep, what you're going to allow to slip in prep is going to be different to what you're going to be happy with off-season, right? So how do you navigate those two different phases?
So talking purely PEDs here, I could talk for hours on the differences between prep and off-season. So I'll sort of formulate it into this, where for any periodization or programming of any variable, it's always needs-based on the individual. And when I say needs-based, that would always also be auto-regulated even on a microcycle to microcycle basis. You know, so what does the individual need to achieve the phase-specific goals over the coming weeks? So in a prep, it's going to be, let's say at the beginning of the prep, it's going to be the total amount of milligrams that allows them to retain all of the muscle tissue that they've got under the degree of deficit that they are under to achieve the desired rate of loss. You know, so that's pretty damn simple. And it's almost always going to be less than the requirement to build new muscle tissue in the off season at that amount of muscularity. Now, as you get closer to the show, as muscle protein breakdown becomes more likely, as these shifts up in things like cortisol and glutamate and all these other things that we spoke about becomes more likely, yes, milligrams are going to have to go up. And there's also going to have to be stack design considerations for cosmetic effects, because we know the androgen to estrogen ratio present in the blood at any one time controls things like fluid balance between extracellular and intracellular fluid volumes. We need to bias as much intracellular volume and as little extracellular volume as possible, right? So we'd have a very androgen dominant stack design that would become more and more androgen dominant as they get towards the show in a prep. The one that is going to make you feel shit and be very sympathetically innervated and disrupt your sleep and whatnot. What you wouldn't want in the off season, you'd essentially want the opposite. You'd want your estrogen to be as high as you can tolerate it within the context of the stack design, right? So that would be the primary differential point. But what I will say is for 90% of my clients, their total androgen load by the end of prep is less than the peak load in the off season, because the amount required to retain tissue into the show is less than the amount that's required to build new tissue at peak off season. And that's definitely a preference when it comes to controlling for the stress total as well.
Wouldn't that be the opposite of what most people do, though?
Maybe, but you see it more now. You know, you do see it more. In fact, I saw John post recently something that kind of caught my eye on Instagram, John Jewett, where he had said the same thing. For his preps, he always runs lower total anabolic because it's the reasons I just gave. And I thought, you know, it is, I mean, mechanistically speaking, it's just true. You know, unless you do something ridiculous, like I'm going to protein spare and modified fast my whole prep, 350 pounds or something, you know, it's going to.
You mentioned there cosmetic effects for the peak. Now, again, when I was looking through your Instagram and stuff like that, there's a couple of things that jumped out at me. Was you talking about fat loading for a peak, which I think doesn't get discussed enough. Like, people just think you deplete carbs and eat carbs, right? It's that simple. That would be cool to just get your thoughts on that and how you implement that properly. I also saw a few things about like skin quality, you know, and how, you know, actually that's going to be a big factor. There's no point being 4% body fat if your skin is terrible or your fluid retention is poor. So I saw the term glazing as well, which I think is would be just for just for my glazing, man. My interest would be cool to that would be cool to go into. You know, I know those are very fine margins, you know, but I think those are very interesting to go into. So if you don't mind just discussing how those factors play into the end result you see for that one day.
I would say any coaches watching this, if you want to be the best at what you do, it's your job. People pay you to get them to win shows, and that extends far beyond nutrition, training, PEDs. You need to be thinking about bringing a mitt to all the shows, knowing how to tan, knowing how to glaze, all of that stuff. You need to have a intimate knowledge of posing trunks, different cuts, where they need to be placed, posing for all classes, all categories. It's your responsibility to know that and be there backstage on show day, lined up with your clients. I can't tell you how many times I've had clients will be lined up backstage at pro qualifiers and no coaches are there and the glazer's all dried up because this category's taking too long, and I'm able just to get on that last little bit of glaze on my client in the right spot, bam, and their colour's so much better. I'm not saying my clients are winning all these pro qualifiers, but just when it comes to that specific element, it's just, you know, missed by so many. I am quite lucky, to be fair. My wife is, she tans at all the IFBB shows in the UK, and we've got all the stuff that I can bring to all the shows, so I'm quite lucky in that sense. But
it is quite surprising to hear that, because I'm sure Dave can echo this. It's super common to go to like a powerlifting meet, and there almost be too many coaches. You're like, you can't move, right? Because they're all in the back with them, warming them up, or they're the ones slapping them on the back or revving them up, however they because they know how they need that. And so it's really interesting to hear that in those scenarios that isn't happening.
Not to say there aren't a lot of coaches backstage.
No, sure, because there are minutiae that are being lost there because of that. You know, so
I think there was a pushback a little bit. Just to jump in, I think that you see a lot of coaches doing a lot of shows, and as coaching become a lot more, I guess, worldwide, you've got coaches all over, you've got clients all over the place. It becomes harder to get to shows, but it also becomes, Joe, you might attest to this, you might not, but when you're coaching people there on the day, they're throwing a lot of input at you, and it can become a little bit harder to coach them.
Very much so.
When someone's telling you what to, I think we should do this, and obviously emotions are high, all these things. When you're at home on the laptop, you can remove yourself from that. When you're there, it's harder to coach to the best level. So I think there's pros and cons. I think, like you said, you're going to have some benefits of being there. There's also some benefits of not being there to make the better, objectively true decision.
I think you lay that foundation before you get there, where you create some distance between the two personalities and the objective goal at hand. You know, where you don't personally identify with the instructions that are being presented. They're a separate thing. You know, so they can't take issue with you as a person if they want to do something different. It's like, no, this actually exists outside of both of us. God, this is getting philosophical. Don't get me started on that, we'll be here for hours. Anyway, you're asking about fat loading. So the first person I ever heard talking about fat loading was Dr. Scott Stevenson, who was, and still is, I think, the best mind that has ever existed in bodybuilding. I have been enamored by his brain through my whole career. I've spent many, many, many hours talking to Scott and listening to Scott. So I have to give full credit to him for so much of what we know in bodybuilding now. And he's still doing it. He's an amazing guy. I don't know if you know Scott, but what a guy and what a brain. Also very well read on his philosophy. Anyway, so in his Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach was talking about fat loading, and we use it pretty similar to the way Scott uses it. I think I use it less so as a means to load intramuscular triglycerides. I don't quite know to what loading capacity they will make a good cosmetic difference. I'll say anecdotally in females, there does seem to be quite a robust shift in intramuscular fullness purely from intramuscular triglyceride loading. In fact, on my Instagram, and they said you look down, I don't know if you saw this, I did a photo of my wife when she won WBFF Worlds, where I did a before and after just fat loading, and the change is ridiculous, and that was 0 carb through the whole thing, and the fullness shift up and the extracellular fluid shift down with no pharmaceutical diuretics or anything. It's crazy. In some men, you won't really notice much of a difference, but regardless, I do like that, I'd say minimum 3-day period in absence of carbohydrate consumption, because we know that that is going to prime insulin sensitivity maximally to super compensate for carbohydrate loading when we get to that. And that is my general preferred peak strategy. It's not the safest peak strategy, but if you've done enough peaks and you've got good clients that can work with you on a close basis and send photos between every meal and things like that, you can do those big super compensatory loads, whether it be a midweek load or a back week load. It's obviously less safe than linear loading over time, but to have that period of absence from carbohydrate and to be truly glycogen depleted and then smash it for 2 to 3 days, as long as you nail the amount, which is going to vary greatly between individuals, then the outcome is very, very nice. So sure, there might be some benefit to the intramuscular triglyceride loading to some degree, but I think it's more so for the insulin sensitivity impact.
True. And when we're talking about these types of processes here, we're getting into the really kind of fine hairs of refining a physique for a specific purpose. With the water management, I'm sure that goes into the fat loading, the carb loading. You mentioned the glazing, and you mentioned on your Instagram the skincare routine and things like that. In your experience, how much of this stuff is not being done well, and then is being made up for by pharmaceutical diuretics, overuse of things like Clen, T3, and all this thing? Like maybe someone actually is lean enough, but they're not doing this other stuff well enough to come in.
The skincare is something that is just, I've almost given up trying to get people to do it, because at 8 weeks out for every client, here's the routine. My wife's got a company called Compact, and it's the largest UK EU posing shoe and stage day essential, like tan, everything that you could possibly need for a show day.
Show day essentials.
Yeah. And she's written so many articles on skincare, how to prepare for your tan, blah, blah, blah. And like I say, I've almost given up trying to get clients to do the skincare because I couldn't make it any easier. Here's a list of what you need. It's like 20 quid. Here's an article on how to do it.
Here's
what you have to do. Yep. Here's the protocol.
Can you share what it is roughly that people are so against doing, or broad strokes?
I think it's the
laziness.
Okay.
Because unless it's growing more muscle, a bodybuilder will eat sand to grow another gram of muscle. But, fix my skin.
I mean, you could throw posing into that mix. I think people look at things like exfoliation and they're like, I can't do my own back. You're like, well, that's your only thing there, is it? Get someone to do it for you. Find a way around. Those are things that if your tan's terrible and it can't stick, it's going to affect your placing. But we can throw posing into the same mix. A lot of people, and it's changing a lot now. We've got some fantastic posing coaches that work for us, but people look at posing as a secondary consideration. They're like, oh, my physique's good enough. It's like, you're going to get beaten by someone who's got a worse physique that can present it better. And it's exactly the same with skincare. If your tan is terrible, it doesn't matter if you're leaner than them. You can't present it. And I think that's the thing people forget is it's not what you look like in the gyms, it's what you look like on stage. And people are getting massively kind of lost in the weeds thinking, but I look better. Judges don't think that. And it's easy to lose placings on that.
We're going to pivot here and talk about training a little bit.
Cool.
So Tom had some questions that he had down that we discussed in the bathroom real quick while you guys weren't around.
One of the things that really caught my I know where the real conversations take place. One of the things that really caught my eye about some of your talk about your training was specialization training. Now I'm very biased here because I love specialization training for athletes, for strength, whatever. Seeing this applied in a bodybuilding context to me is extremely interesting, especially considering how you mentioned already that they tend to be very goal orientated. So having a short-term goal in the specialization phases probably feeds into them very well. So would you mind just going into a little bit your approach of how you create kind of specialization phases within a bodybuilder's program, both in the short term and also then in the long term? So that we also don't create imbalance as well, because obviously that needs to be kind of thought about there too.
I think people have naturally got imbalances where that's why you need a specialization phase. When you look at anyone, they're going to have genetic proclivity to grow muscle in certain areas and not so much in others. Let's say someone is genetically blessed to have massive quads, but they've got really lagging chest, as an example. That doesn't mean that, because what most people do is they say, stick on a program and everyone's going to follow that thing. But that clearly isn't working because they're getting imbalances from that. So therefore, having a balanced program isn't the answer. You need to imbalance that program. And sometimes that's going to be merely a shift in volume. And by the way, I'm making the caveat that this is someone who knows how to train. We're not running into someone that hasn't got the ability to connect with that. We're talking about just from a genetic proclivity, because obviously that's a whole different kettle of fish. When we start to look at that, we can either say we're going to pivot our training volume, so we're going to take away from areas that are stronger to areas that are weaker. That would be specialization, so we can shift some volume. We could also potentially look at our volume as a totality. So let's say someone's got 100 working sets per week. I'm just making a number here, by the way. I'm not saying that's the number we need to go for as a number. Maybe we allocate a higher percentage, or we reduce that percentage down so we've got more recovery demands. So we say in areas that are particularly strong, let's say you've got a classic competitor that needs to stay at weight cap, and they're at the weight cap, where they're going to grow. You need to let some areas downsize automatically. And then the way you can structure that is going to be a million different ways. That could be a volume, frequency, intensity thing. Unlikely going to be intensity given our cohort. But if we think about, okay, how frequently are they hitting that thing? How many sets are they doing per session? Is there a way we can sort of do more? Do we look at certain exercise selection? You can start to go down the rabbit hole for everything. It could be a volume thing. It could be, again, we're going to rule of execution. It could be an exercise selection thing here. Ultimately, we're going to look at someone's weekly volume, total volume, recovery capabilities, and leverage that more towards the area that needs it and more away from areas that don't. You could think about any situation. You've got things in your life, you've got things in your financial budget, you've got things within your business, you've got things you're going to move away from that you're really strong and things you're going to work towards. So exactly the same principle applies. Unfortunately, people tend to go into this really balanced approach with programming, which is going to work for a lot of beginners, intermediates. When you get to the advanced level, guys like Joe's working with a lot of the time, and some of my guys are, we've got the ability to shift things over.
Yeah, you mentioned a really good point at the end. That's probably a good caveat to put on this, because like these kind of things are really enticing because they seem like nuanced and intricate and almost like cool in a way, you know, the novelty, like, yeah, I want to do this specificity program and stuff. Like for most physique athletes, this isn't for you. I think most people need to spend the majority of their time growing everything, because in all likelihood you're just too small, you know, to be competitive anywhere. So, you know, don't fall into the novelty of that. I do program a hell of a lot of specialization and specificity based pieces of programming for my clients, because that level of nuance is what's required, and that might be for many different reasons. So for one reason might be in a hypermuscular individual that the total degree of stimulus that they require to grow anything is more than they can tolerate and recover from if it was on a systemic basis. You know, so maybe we would choose over the course of an off season to grow 2 body parts per mesocycle and leave everything else on maintenance, or they've got the nervous system capacity to facilitate that degree of growth, you know. So maybe we're going to do quads and hams, and then lateral delts and lats, and then pecs and traps or something, you know. I'm just putting stuff out my ass here. So that's one case scenario that's quite common. The more common one, I have a large cohort of classic guys, and especially classic guys that are at the cap. So what that is about is looking at how they look when they get back to the cap, because that could be representative of their competitive package for the rest of their life if they don't do anything about it, you know. It's like if you're at the cap, skinned out of your mind, peaked to perfection and placing 10th, what are you going to do? Just wait for everybody else to retire, you know?
Yeah.
You're fucked. So unless you say, okay, let's look at the criteria, and this is where, you know, we were talking about having an intimate understanding of posing and skin prep and tan and whatever. Before you get to that, every coach should understand in depth the criteria that their clients are being judged against. The balance, symmetry, proportion of the classic criteria. Pair that up to where your client is right now, assuming that they are skinned and peeled out of their mind and, you know, peaked perfectly. What needs to change? there'll need to be some drop off in places, very typically, it's lose a bit of size on the quads, gain a bit more size in the lateral delts, maybe the arms, the lats, clavicular pec, things like that. And that's where we would sort of bias the specificity around what we know about the kind of dose response of the frequency and volume equation. So it might be, well, if we want to maintain a body part, we know that we need to train it once a week with about 3 sets to 1 to 2 hour. Cool, we'll do that. Okay, if we need to grow a body part, we need to do sort of at least 1 set twice a week, so the frequency component plays in, and then we'll have a dose response according to how prioritized that is. So if it's top priority, maybe we'll see if they can adapt and recover from like 4 sets twice a week, or maybe 3 sets 3 times a week. Maybe if it's moderate priority, it might be 2 sets twice a week or something like that. And you can roughly structure that out and then watch their progressive overload capabilities over time and what happens to the physique, and consistently auto-regulate. So I never really write clients programming on, here's what you're doing for the next 3 months. It's, here's what you're doing this week. Let's see what happens across the board on everything and see if we need to auto-regulate anything when it comes to exercise order or volume or the progression scheme that you're following or the proximity to failure that you're going to be using and things like that. Microcycle to microcycle basis, but it all comes back to the same thing that we discussed on the drugs front, is like needs-based always. What does the individual need right now? But a lot of coaches won't want to do that because it requires a lot of attention to detail and time.
You mean coaching?
Yeah. Because it's not unusual for a coach to say, I've got 150 clients. If I had 150 clients, I would never go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But it just depends on the caliber of client. It's not to say that you can't.
Yeah.
Because like Matt, for example, you've probably got twice as many clients as me now, but my check-ins are taking at least 2 times as long.
Yeah, sure.
I
just think it's interesting that route of specializing, you see that in elite athletes in every aspect. In powerlifting, at some point you can't progress your squat, bench, and deadlift at the same time. If it's a sports athlete, at some point you can't get more muscle and stronger and more powerful at the same time. Something has to happen where you periodize these things, right? And I just think it's really cool to see someone, you're the first that I really know talking about that more in a bodybuilding aspect, where like the amount of volume you have to do to try and grow everything at some point will probably be impossible to do. You're talking about it there in the context of a cat, but I'm sure that can also be applied there as well, where like you need to get bigger, but you can't grow everything at once because you can't recover.
Yeah.
So
super common, like super heavyweight guys, very common, where like just the systemic load of training everything progressively is too much.
Like sometimes the best thing that can happen to that person, this can sound stupid to say it, they pick up a small injury and they're like, oh shit, everything else grew. You're like, can we connect the dots here? Because like you couldn't train other things and you're able to train something else, and that was able to now shift, or at least say you're just tapping against this invisible ceiling, you've taken that visible ceiling away because you can actually recover and progress, because again systemic loads come down. Sometimes it's as simple as that, but when we're talking about people that don't want to lose muscle, they're going to hold on tight to that training volume. They do not want to let that go. So it comes down to what you mentioned, like drugs, having that conversation, understanding what the long-term goal is to get people to buy into that thing.
Well, it's a good point, because it's exactly the same as the drugs, because if they're trying to bring up a body part and it's in the off season and they're at their maximal recoverable volume, they just add more. If they want to bring their pecs up, they just do more. Yeah. They do more pecs, which exceeds that because nothing else came out. So you got to kind of know the minimal effective dose and the maximal effective dose, same as what we were talking about.
Yeah, I think in my experience as well, like we know that there's an inverted U response to volume, right? That's not technically an evidence-based phraseology, I would say, because I mean, there's the ridiculousness, and I do think there's ridiculousness of high volume studies now.
52 sets a week.
52 sets a week and whatnot. There's this linear dose response. I personally don't believe that for a second, and I'd really like to solve the edema equation before we start taking that as
but also fact. In those contexts, like over what time frame, like sure you could
8-week study
again, you take like a strength athlete, like sure you could train your squat 4 days a week for 8 weeks, and what will happen? Your squat will go up.
And
what then?
Big issues taken.
How long can you do that for? What else pays the price later on, so on and so forth. So sorry,
but I actually don't think those studies are worth talking about for our cohort, because they're, I mean, even if it's true, right, I'll go and give all my clients 52 sets. It's going to fall apart.
But not just that. I'd love to see either of you guys get through a workout like that, training hard.
Crazy. Stupid.
You ain't doing it.
No one that's strong can do that. So when they say well-trained participants, it was like that recent study leaving 7 reps in reserve. They gained 47% strength. But I've never heard of any advanced person gaining 47% strength in 8 weeks ever.
Ever.
You know, definitely not leaving 7 reps in reserve. You know, you can read that summary and go, it's ridiculous. But anyway, more to my point. The inverted U, I find, is much narrower the more advanced that you get. You know, so the tolerable volume of which is like peak magnitude of exposure gets less and less and less as your training age goes up for hypertrophy outcomes, in my experience. Far from it being the bigger you are, the more you can handle. It's typically completely the opposite, which makes sense, doesn't it? If you're generating more sort of force velocity output per rep and activating more high threshold motor unit recruitment, there's more central fatigue. And
no, I've seen the same thing across the board with strength athletes.
Yeah.
So when you're running those specialization blocks, you know, let's say you've got like a bikini competitor, it's like glutes and hamstrings and shoulders, or you know, something like that.
That's just bikini training.
Yeah. Okay. So like, okay.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because without realizing it, people that coach bikini athletes or bikini competitors in general, they just automatically fall into specificity.
True.
And it's quite intelligent.
Being facetious.
No, I get it. It's cool. But my question was just going to be, when, let's say the specialization phase is, you know, for 2 muscle groups or whatever, how much of that individual's training volume then is made up by those muscle groups, and then how much is assigned to maintaining everything else?
So maintenance if I had to give a general recommendation, although there's going to be variability, to maintain a muscle, the literature suggests 3 sets once a week is sufficient. So that's what I'll typically program for body parts that are on maintenance. And then the specificity body parts anywhere from 2 to 4 times a week. And then anything from 1 to, I would say up to 6 sets, but it's so rare that I would program 6 sets of a body part in a single session. I'll probably say 1 to 4 sets per body part per session for this body parts of specificity. I normally start around 2 and will auto-regulate up or down depending on what happens with progressive overload.
Sure. The point to add to that is just, again, like Joe mentioned, don't you see what happens in the real world. So like, can I program at the lower end and then see where they can tolerate? And I tend to go off some metrics in a specialization phase specifically, like, okay, are you progressing? Are you getting sore? What's the kind of the disruption throughout the session? So this is a personal thing I tend to look at in these phases, is you say you've got an athlete who's doing 2 failure, 10, 9, 8 across 3 sets, they could probably maybe do more. They've probably got the ability to maybe go there, assuming, again, training intensity is legit, versus someone who's going 10, 5, 4, there's a significant drop off. So I'm thinking the second individual might need less work, the first individual might need more work. I think that's just, again, that's a really, in context to everything else, then start to add in more volume as the time goes on. But the maintenance, again, as long as they're not getting weaker, we know we can strongly say we're at maintenance. Some people might need a higher maintenance volume, some might need less. So.
And I really like the programming of volume in line with what offers us the most chronic progressive overload, rather than the highest per session volume that offers progressive overload on a per week basis. Sounds like it didn't make sense. So to explain that,
what you said earlier about the 8-week thing.
Yeah. So let's say a client could do 4 sets per body part for 4 weeks, 4 sets per body part per session for 4 weeks before overreaching and needing a deload, versus 3 sets per body part that they can do almost concurrently forever. You know, if they can have that balance like we were talking about earlier, that's definitely my preference, to have that chronic stimulus, which ultimately leads them training with what most would consider low volumes. Like most of my clients are training somewhere between 2 to 4 sets per body part per session, twice a week, pretty normal. You know, weekly volumes will be somewhere 4 to 8 for most of my clients, which seems to shock people. And I didn't end up like camped there for some reason. Like this just happened with watching and auto-regulating over time.
True. You mentioned the frequency there for the specialized body parts being high. So like if we're talking like a microcycle or a weekly split or whatever, are those specialized muscles always being hit together, and then like everything else that's on maintenance is being put like on their own, or how are you kind of splitting it up? Obviously in general, there's going to be variation.
So exercise order is important, because we know that fatigue accumulates intra-session, and therefore your ability to activate high threshold motor unit, recruit high threshold motor units, dissipates to some degree. Now, if you're training with mega low volumes, it's not going to be a huge consideration, but generally speaking, you want your earlier exercises to be of your prioritized body parts. So if we have a specialization phase that's like, let's say we got this bikini girl, like glutes and lateral delts, I probably wouldn't have her train glutes and then lateral delts. You know, maybe she'd be on upper lower, and at the beginning of her lower sessions, hitting glutes first, when fatigue is lowest, when motor unit recruitment is highest, and then on her upper days, hitting lateral delts first for the same reason. You know, so I would always try to order by which specificity comes first. And if you can split that out, then perfect, which is why I have a lot of classic guys that will train, let's say on their lower body days, they'll do lateral delts first and then train their legs. You know, if legs aren't a priority body part, like legs are on maintenance, or biceps first or whatever, or even on upper body days, it might be arms first if we've got pecs and lats and traps on maintenance or something like that. You know, whenever somebody asks me about like a split, strange, when I program training, it's like I don't ever have a split in mind, like upper, lower, or push-pull legs or something like that. I allocate the volume per body part and the order and the frequency, and then you program that out, and it ends up being whatever it is. And it can often just look like, you know, what kind of split's this? I'll have someone doing like a lateral delt movement, an ab movement, a calf movement, and then a bicep movement or something. It's like, I don't know what you call that day, but it is what it is.
No,
I think that's great, because I have said to individuals before, like, I think the training split is the least important variable of your whole, and sometimes you get looked at like, because, you know, to some people, they get caught in that headspace where they're like, oh, you know, well, I grew really well when I did back and bis, chest and tris, but then I swapped to upper lower, and now I don't grow. And it's like, dude,
you're missing the tree.
Yeah, the split is just how you organize the work, right? And like in that scenario, it's like it doesn't matter what you call it. It's like, this is the work you need to do. Go do it. When people are running those splits where a lot of the training volume is going on, say, lesser muscle groups, when we're looking at recovery, I'm presuming their total weekly volume is probably the same or very similar. So what do you have to look out for then when, you know, certain muscle groups or maybe certain joints are now being trained with much higher volume than they are used to? Like, do you find that you have to prep people for that, or there are different like red flags you need to watch out for in terms of like their global recovery might be fine, but like local recovery on what you're specializing on may not be?
There's a difference between like central fatigue and joint ligament tendon fatigue. To be honest, it's not commonly an issue I would find in bodybuilder types to have joint tendon ligament issues outside of like chronic overuse injuries, and a lot of that is like unavoidable. Like when we talk about rep ranges, for example, like generally for hypertrophy, we would want to program the lowest rep range you can tolerate in absence of joint and tendon issues, as long as it's above maybe 4 or 5 reps. You know, so very typical for me to use a rep range like 5 to 9 or 4 to 9. And from a fatigue management standpoint and a time efficiency standpoint, where you're getting all of the reps that are going to recruit the highest threshold motor units, you know, that last 4, 5, maybe 5 reps, great. But telling someone to do a set of 4 lateral raises, you know, sometimes is
or flies
can be hard. But then, you know, if we're talking cuffed line lateral raises for 8 to 10, you know, where you're reducing the moment arm to the GH joint, maybe you want to cuff at the forearm or even above the elbow, it can work quite well. You know, you just have to make those considerations, or pushing the rep range up. I generally find higher frequency training to be less we'll say deleterious is the right word to use here on the joints as compared to higher volume per session. So things like the lateral delts, if they're on specificity, I'll have clients train them 4 or 5 times a week, maybe, you know.
I think the only other thing there is just the logistics, as in you're not going to run a specialization phase for that long. So you can usually get out before it becomes a problem. I'm not saying that's always the case, because obviously, say using the same movement pattern, for example, let's say I've had it before with clients who only got a leg press, and they're leg pressing for everything. Like a specialization block with a leg press, just that is probably not going to be your best bet, because it's the same movement pattern. You're going to grease that groove, maybe that's the point where it's the same exposure, you're getting hit with the same thing. And like any bit of machinery, if I was just going to twist this on the same axis every single time, there's probably going to be a bit of misuse. But assuming that's not the case, by the time you finish that specialization block, according to like your macro cycle of the year, hopefully you'll be out before there's any overuse, providing you're doing all the other stuff, the stuff with like the stress management, sleep, all the other stuff we spoke about beforehand.
And how long do these phases last? I know there's going to be variability there, but let's say like a typical specialization block, how long would that last for an individual? I'm sure maybe it varies by their experience level.
Honestly, until the job's done.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you will just say, shoulders need work. Here's block 1. Here's block 2. Are we there yet? No. Here's block 3. And go.
And I honestly auto-regulate everything on a microcycle basis, on a weekly basis. You know, I'm looking at the physique every single week. Until I'm looking at that physique and the lateral delts are balanced in this case, then it's keep going. Unless there's some problem solving to get done in there.
Do you ever find there's like some kind of rebound effect during where, like, say, a muscle group like lateral delts, it's being trained so frequently, maybe it's just like being depleted all the time, or it gets inflamed, and then it's when you stop, then you get some kind of, it's not super compensation or whatever, but like maybe now it's glycogen.
I've only ever seen that in individuals that have trained with excessively high volumes and then pull back to volumes more so maybe what I would consider to be more efficient, productive.
The only thing I've ever seen is if someone's exceptionally fatigued and now they're just full. That's the only thing I've seen. Is it's not like you just said, a glycogen thing. That's the only time I've ever seen it. All of a sudden now they're just not fatigued. They're not. That's the wrong word, because they've still got glycogen, but maybe they're so fatigued they're not actually able to be able to kind of resynthesize that and put it there. It tends to be a flatter muscle. So that's the only time I've seen that. Really,
a common example of that is like when a physique athlete deloads and they come back to the gym and they're way stronger. That's, to me, is a symptom of just central nervous system overreaching, indicative of improper use of training volume.
Sure.
You know, almost never, if you're doing things properly, should you deload and come back stronger.
Sure. The reason I ask that is because someone's going to hear this, probably more than one, and go, cool, I'm going to do that. Right? And then they're going to get to the point where they're trying to grow their pecs and their pecs look shriveled up and small or whatever. And they're like, it's going to bounce back once
they need to pay attention to the volume that they're talking about, right? And that's assuming that the sets are hard, right? I mean, 3 work sets a week, right? It's not hard. It's probably not going to do shit.
Yeah.
But a lot of the people that are going to listen are probably doing way higher volumes.
The things I've been that guy before. Like, I'm not saying my chest anything to write home about, because this is not. But there'll be times where I'll be thinking like 25 sets a week, and I'm training hard, and I'm just not growing, and I'm just going, well, am I the one special snowflake? Or is it the fact that I'm being a fucking idiot with my training volume? It's probably like Occam's razor. Is it me being a snowflake or me being an idiot? It's the idiot. And as soon as you scale that back, so actually now I'm doing a more reasonable number for me, 10 sets a week. Oh shit, now I'm growing. And I think sometimes we always go into this thing of more is more, and it's one of those lessons where I'm sure we've all done it, but it's one of the lessons I wouldn't have listened to me now tell me that. So sometimes you've got to go through that, but have this conversation in mind. Sometimes more is not more. It's actually going to be worse for you.
When you're using this lower volume approach with your training, the harder high RPE sets, and most would say is low volume overall. How do you see the role of intensification methods in there? Do you see them as useful at all, or are they periodized in some degree?
So I love the use of cluster sets. I was of the era of DC training. I trained DC for years, and then I did fortitude training, as you can imagine, like Dr. Scott fanatic for years as well. And I like using my rep sets with clients more so now, because I do find that 1 to 2 RAR landmark allows for a greater efficiency of fatigue modulation for more, we'll say, potent hypertrophy outcomes over time with management of volume in general. So, similar to what would be like a DC rest pause set, I use that quite typically, but at like a 1 RAR, where maybe they'd work to 1 RAR, take a few deep breaths, 1 RAR, and there might be 2 to 3 mini sets, typical to how Borge Figeli would program the my rep sets. Beyond that, I don't use any other intensification technique. I think straight sets to 1 RAR are going to be your best bet. If you want some time efficiency, do my rep sets. I'm not of the camp either that thinks that cluster sets accumulate an astronomical amount of fatigue versus the equivalent number of straight sets. That is something a lot of people,
I think, only if you're taking them all to failure.
I've just never seen it anecdotally happen, and I think that you can almost mechanistically masturbate, excuse my language, on it for a long period of time. I've just never seen somebody have this excessive fatigue accumulation of, like, let's say a triple my rep rest pause set versus 3 straight sets.
Mm-hmm.
Which in effective reps would be about equivalent.
Sure.
I've just never seen it happen.
The only time I'll caveat that, sorry, is I have seen that with people that just take every single set, mini set or otherwise, to failure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only time I've seen fatigue accumulate much quicker than we expect it to. And my theory is just because we're just constantly hammering the high threshold motor units. That's, again, personal pet theory. And we obviously know that's kind of the mechanistic way that it works.
Mm-hmm.
But I have seen that. Hard to say, is it more than 3? It seems to me like it is.
But I mean, logically speaking, if someone's hitting failure 3 times in a set as opposed to 1, you can probably say neurologically that's probably pretty harsh.
Yeah, especially in the short time.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I'm happy to put my hands up and say this is my anecdote here as well.
But you mentioned not using other intensification techniques other than those type of DC style rests. Going to put myself out on the limb maybe here, but are not the most of the tried and tested, or the ones that have lasted the length of time, not really all variations of that? Like muscle rounds by Scott Stevenson, my reps are almost the same thing. You rest a little bit, go to near failure again, rest. A drop set is kind of the same.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of drop sets. I think I don't like. Sorry, man. That's right. I just don't like anything that puts you back in a position where you're exposing yourself to reps that aren't activating those high threshold motor unit recruitments, and you have to get back to that.
Sure.
That eliminates the point of the intensification technique, which to me is basically just time efficiency.
Yeah.
You know, if we're going to look at something that saves us time for the same amount of hypertrophy, ideally with net the same or even less fatigue accumulation, that would be the whole point. And I don't think the drop sets achieve that.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I think we say you're going to go out a limb, I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to get me I think of all those techniques, you could say dog crap training or anything other than that, I think my rep's just the most intelligently way done, the way it's done there. Just because essentially the idea behind it, like we said, is accumulate as many effective reps if we're going to use that model as possible. That seems to be the most efficient way of doing that. Now, we could just say let's all do straight sets, and I would have no problem with that. But I like to use them certainly in dieting phases of certain individuals for fatigue management, if done properly. Time efficiency, I use them all the time because I've got fuck all time to train. I find it really helpful. But yeah, I think that's probably the one I'd go for, and also from a tracking perspective as well. A drop set becomes very difficult in order to track that. So how do you track what you did there? Like you tracking the initial set, the down set? You track both. Same for a cluster set. Okay, is the intensity the same across all? And my rep just seems a little bit more clean in my opinion.
Yeah, they're mega easy to track. Yeah. I've got some clients that train exclusively with my rep sets. And they love it.
Is that a prolonged method though, or is that phased in and out?
No, literally over the long term when they're extremely time bound or they do other things. For example, my clients that do combat sports as well. I've got a lot of those. And this is me, myself. I train jiu-jitsu 5 days a week and I live 4 days a week. I've got to get in my lift in early and then go to jiu-jitsu. Sometimes it's only an hour later because of the way that the day's panned out. So if I can go in and do 1 myo-rep set for chest, 1 myo-rep set for biceps, 1 myo-rep set for triceps, just do 1 myo-rep per body part, and you're getting the equivalent of 3 sets worth, do that twice a week, and you can do that in half an hour.
True. I mean, I like that because this is something we run into a lot in the strength world, where trying to get lifters to do hypertrophy work, and they don't want to put the time in. And I'm sure you get the same with BJJ and stuff like I don't have the time to train enough. It's like, dude, like 1 myo rep set per muscle group or whatever per week.
It takes no time, and they are fun. Like I break ball gauge rules, and I do them to like 5 to 9 on the initial set. And then
that's the same way I program.
Man, hella fun.
I do like 6 to 10 and then 2s usually.
Yep, 2s and 3s. Yep. For like 3 mini sets. Perfect. Super fun.
Yeah.
That's cool. That I like how clean that ended up being in there.
Yeah, we've confirmation biased each other.
Of course, fantastic. Welcome to the echo chamber, especially with the strength athletes.
Something that I'm sure you're probably dealing with right now that I'd be keen to get your input on is, are you getting a lot of kickback from your clients right now about saying, well, I don't need a calorie surplus anymore?
we spoke about this in the plane yesterday. Right, so let me lay this out. I think there's do you know what, this is it's a Paul Carterism, isn't it? I've not followed Paul closely, or at all, to be honest. If people just keep saying to me, what do you think of Paul Carter saying? I think if you said the phrase, you can build muscle, or the research suggests that you're likely to be able to drive protein accretion maximally at your TDEE, that's correct. You know, the research does suggest that if you consume your total daily energy expenditure, and of that sufficient protein intake and progressive trainer stimulus, then you probably can. But there's
the rubber meets the road in a way.
Yeah, there's a lot of, because when you say maintenance, people think that means maintaining body weight. Well, obviously, if you maintain your body weight forever, you're not driving protein accretion either, because if you're not getting heavier, well, muscle actually, it weighs something, you know. So maintenance calories is a tricky thing for people to picture when actually you're talking total daily energy expenditure is a different thing. And your body weight will climb up because your total daily energy expenditure increases as you gain muscle. You know, is that a surplus? Yeah, technically it is, you know. So all that is jargon. You know, it's kind of wanking around terminologies, I think. Realistically, what would be better is if you said, because it's so hard to determine, like if someone said, I'm just going to consume maintenance and whatnot. It's like, well, why not actually, let's just say, let's have a really reasonable rate of gain, like 0.5% every 2 weeks, or 1% of body weight every month. You know, if you aim to do that, then yeah, you likely are topping out protein accretion, you know. And if you can gain 6 to 10 pounds of stage weight, which is loads, in a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot then.
Yeah, but that's like, you say to someone, yeah, gain 12 pounds in a year, that might be 1% of their, you know, 12 pounds, like, what, a pound a month? People are like, what?
That's what you're working for, sorry.
Getting loads of muscle. Yeah.
The thing I see with the maintenance debate, if it is a debate, it's, like Joe says, if it's a TDE and you can grow at that, absolutely. But we're dealing with human beings, it's not a calculation. And I'd go, right, we've probably got a limited time frame in which we're working. We're probably dealing with a bunch of other variables. I'd much rather set up like a 5-10% surplus and know we've got a expectation for the client of what the rate of gain is. Because if I said to the client, we're going to maintain that, instantly, that even just the semantics of that sounds like no progress, doesn't it? So if we said, okay, we're just going to set up a gaining phase, which is 5-10% surplus, that's what this is going to look like approximately on paper. Like we said, a reasonable rate of gain. We're going to accrue as much tissue as we can gain realistically, which we can then wash off any body fat that we put on. That's also something we can, what gets measured gets managed, right? So we can say, okay, this is going up, and I can be fairly confident, as long as everything else is in place, training wise, etc., I'm going to be gaining muscle.
You won't maintain at your TDE either, because, you know, as you progressively overload, your expenditure per session goes up, your post-exercise oxygen consumption goes up, and then as your muscle mass goes up, your total weight that you're moving through space goes up, and it's more metabolically expensive than other tissue. So therefore your calories will go up and your body weight will go up. And whether you want to call that maintenance or a surplus or whatever, I don't, it doesn't matter, you know.
Do you think this is one of those arguments though where just because you can do something doesn't mean it's
just a useless argument.
Like, you know, can you gain muscle on a keto diet? Sure. Are any top pros using a keto diet to get huge? No. Because we can all probably agree it's not optimal. So like, sure, can you gain muscle there? Yeah, okay.
There's a certain type of human on social media that likes to do things that are counterculture to generate annoyance. I think, which is strange. And I think that also envelops a camp of people that like to follow that kind of person as well.
It's almost like we found the cheat code.
Yeah.
So, well, actually, like you mentioned before about sports athletes, I always like to look at what do the high performers do. And typically, anyone that has built a significant amount of muscle mass over a period of time have done bulk and cut cycles. It doesn't need to be the Lee Priest-esque push up, come down, but there can be a steady increase here. Just because someone said, oh, I can show you the way, and I'm probably going to sell you some magic beans along
the way.
Yeah.
The way. That's the thing. You know.
There's probably a program coming out with that as well. My thought process is look at the hundreds of thousands of people that have had success doing it this way. Do we need to lean heavily away from that to win, essentially, at this game? Probably not.
Yeah, and as usual, there's a reasonable middle ground, which is just have a reasonable rate of gain per week. You know, it might be close to your TDEE. It might be a little surplus. It doesn't really matter what we call it. Who cares? You know, just gain a little bit of body weight over time, be reasonable with it. Don't allow unnecessary body fat gain, progressively overload your training. Cool.
That sounds like it's going to sell really poorly on you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah, we need to wrap this up. Was there any topics you guys want to talk about we didn't bring up?
I think we've been pretty
I don't think so. No. I think we covered it quite nicely. And if anybody watching wants, you know, the one thing that we didn't say right at the beginning when we were talking about the development of Physique Collective was the way that we present the information, which we've worked so hard to cultivate. And this is still a passion project for us. We still don't personally take money from the company. We put it back into the videography, into the app development, into the forum development. So it's complete for the community, and we can honestly say that, you know, like, we're here off our own back to do things for Physique Collective whilst we're here, like the videographer being here. And that's all. Anyway, separate topic. It is all for you guys that are on the app, so thank you, and I hope that you all like it. But anyway, the way that we present the information, we've specifically cut topics down to 5 to 10 minute maximums with subtitles across multiple languages in a way that is very easy to understand and comprehend. There's no scientific jargon at all on any of the videos, and they're very specific topics. And we've got hundreds of hours. We're probably encroaching on 1,000 hours of educational content now. We've got a Q&A on there. We've got an Ask Joe Anything thread that's just done 8,000 replies, I think it is. So I've answered 8,000 questions on there. You know, we're on there every single day. The community is thriving. So you can watch the content. You can request any content. We're constantly filming the content professionally, getting its subtitles, like I said, across all different languages. And anything that you don't understand, you can go on the forum and get it answered the same day, because we want this to be as easy and as painless as possible.
What is the URL for that?
If you go onto the App Store or Google Play Store and search Physique Collective, it will come up. It's only $9.99 a month, again, because we're not trying to take big cash off it.
URLs Physique Collective.
Yes, and if you go on physiquecollective.com, you'll find all of our ebooks and a link to the app and everything on there.
All right. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's great. We could just talk for 8 hours.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
All right. So we're done.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All content you see on this channel and at elitefts.com is created by, take a guess, Elite FTS. If you want to help support the content, head over to elitefts.com and pick up literally anything that you need to be able to get more jacked and strong.